There are moments in the story of Naruto Uzumaki that the world remembers. The day he became a genin. The day he faced Zabuza Momochi on a mist-choked bridge and watched his sensei bleed chakra like water through cupped hands. But there is one moment, a small one, almost invisible, buried in the quiet hours of a forest in the land of waves, that nobody remembers. Because nobody was supposed to see it happen. Not even Naruto himself understood what he'd just done. If you've been following this series, you already know the shape of the story so far. Team 7 crossed into the land of waves on what was supposed to be a simple C-rank escort mission. Protect a bridge builder named Tazuna, keep him alive long enough to finish a bridge that might just save an entire country from starvation and tyranny. And you know it stopped being simple the moment two rogue mist neens surfaced from a puddle on the road, followed not long after by a monster of a swordsman named Zabuza Momochi, wielding a blade the size of a grown man and a killing intent that pressed down on 3 genin like the weight of the sky itself. Kakashi Hatake survived that fight. Barely. He tore his own Sharingan out of the fog of a water clone jutsu, and traded blows with an S-rank missing nin until his chakra ran dry enough to leave him swaying on his feet. And in the moment he should have died, trapped in a crushing water prison, powerless to defend himself, it wasn't Sasuke's cool composure or Sakura's sharp mind that saved him. It was Naruto. Reckless, loud, impossible to kill Naruto, who threw himself at a legendary assassin with nothing but a kunai and stubbornness, because giving up was never a language he learned to speak. That's the Naruto everyone already knows. The kid who refuses to fall down. But this chapter isn't about that fight. This chapter is about what happens after the fighting stops, when the adrenaline fades, when the enemy retreats to lick his wounds, and when a tired sensei with one working eye decides it's time to actually teach his students something. Because sometimes the most dangerous discoveries don't happen in the middle of a battle. Sometimes they happen in the quiet after one, when nobody's watching, and a boy who's spent his whole life being told what he isn't finally does something nobody expected him to be able to do at all. Before you get comfortable, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because this series is about to crack open a side of Naruto that canon never gave him a chance to show, and trust me, you don't want to miss where this goes. Now, let's go back to Tazuna's house, 3 days after the bridge. The morning sun hadn't fully cleared the tree line when Kakashi Hatake pushed open the door to the room where his 3 genin were sprawled across the floor in various states of half-awake grumbling. He looked, frankly, terrible. His visible eye was underlined with the kind of exhaustion that came from tearing a bloodline limit out of its socket, and using it against a man who very nearly killed him. His left eye, the one that didn't belong to him, the one that had cost him a friend to earn, was covered again beneath its familiar slanted headband, resting, recovering, waiting. "Rise and shine," he said, in the same infuriatingly calm tone he used whether the building was on fire or breakfast was simply late. "We're doing something important today." Sakura sat up first, blinking sleep out of her eyes, hair mussed against her forehead. "Important like training, or important like you almost died and we should let you rest?" "Little of both," Kakashi said. "Emphasis on training." Sasuke was already awake. He was always already awake, in that maddening way of his. Like sleep was something he tolerated rather than needed, arms crossed, leaning against the wall with the particular stillness of someone pretending not to be curious. And then there was Naruto, still face down on his sleeping mat, one arm dangling off the edge, snoring loud enough to rattle the paper screen door. Sakura's eye twitched. "Naruto! Wake up!" The resulting explosion of limbs, blankets, and outraged shouting that followed doesn't need much description if you already know Naruto Uzumaki. Within about 10 seconds he'd gone from dead asleep to standing at rigid attention, one hand still tangled in his blanket like a cape, shouting, I'm up, I said Zabuza, where's Zabuza? Zabuza is recovering somewhere in this country with a partner who's stitching his wounds back together. Kakashi said, unbothered. Which means we have time. Time we're going to use wisely. Get dressed. Meet me out back in 10 minutes. That got everyone's attention. Tazuna's backyard wasn't much, a modest stretch of packed dirt giving way to the edge of the surrounding forest, the kind of thin, struggling woodland that came from a country too poor and too oppressed to spend resources on anything but survival. But it was enough space for what Kakashi had planned, and when the three of them filed out to find him standing at the base of a particularly tall, straight tree, arms crossed, single eye crinkled in that way that meant he was either amused or about to make their lives very difficult, usually both, they knew something was coming. Chakra control, Kakashi said without preamble. All three of you have raw ability. None of you have refined it the way you'll need to if you want to survive a fight against someone like Zabuza again, because make no mistake, we are not done with him. He's regrouping. Which means we need to get stronger, faster than he does. So what's the exercise? Sasuke asked, arms folded, dark eyes narrowed in that permanently evaluating way of his. Kakashi turned, walked to the base of the tree, and, without a running start, without hand seals, without so much as glancing down, simply walked up the trunk. Straight up. 90 degrees from the ground, boots planted against bark like gravity had quietly decided not to apply to him today, until he was standing sideways 10 feet up, looking down at three stunned faces. Tree climbing, he said. Without your hands. Sakura's mouth fell open. Sasuke's eyebrows twitched upward, the Uchiha equivalent of a full gasp. Naruto just stared, mouth working soundlessly for a second before words caught up to his brain. That's actually really cool. How are you not falling? Chakra, Kakashi said, walking back down as easily as he'd walked up, is the fusion of physical and spiritual energy. Most of what you've done so far, the substitution, the transformation, the clone jutsu, required only a rough, general application of it. This is different. This requires precision. You need to channel exactly the right amount of chakra to your feet, continuously, adjusting in real time. Too little, and you slide off. Too much. He didn't finish that sentence out loud. He didn't need to. And the tree ends up worse for it, he said instead, more diplomatically, and gestured at the trunk he just walked. Small splinters and cracked bark spiraled faintly up its length where chakra had blown outward in uneven bursts before he'd smoothed his control out at the top. Overdo it, and you'll blast yourself off the trunk instead of sticking to it. This is a fundamental exercise for every shinobi. And it's also, not coincidentally, the exact skill that's going to let you survive against an enemy who can walk on water without thinking about it. He tossed 3 kunai at their feet. Mark your progress on the trunk as you climb. Take a running start, focus your chakra, and go as high as you can before you lose your grip or blow yourself backward. When you fall, and you will fall, figure out what went wrong and adjust. This is about control, not brute strength. Understood? Understood, Sakura said immediately, kunai already in hand. Sasuke grunted something that might have been agreement. Naruto just grinned, all teeth, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. Easy. Watch this. He wasn't wrong to be confident, in a sense. Confidence had never been his problem. Precision, on the other hand, was going to be an entirely different story, and every single person watching except Naruto himself already suspected it. Sakura went first, and if you know this story, you already know what happened. She took 3 steps up the trunk, chakra flows smooth and controlled from the very first attempt, made it clean to the crown of the tree, and stood there at the top looking almost as surprised as everyone else, because for the first time in Team 7's short history, Sakura Haruno had genuinely, unambiguously outperformed both of her teammates on a technical exercise. Kakashi's visible eye crinkled with something that looked suspiciously like pride. Impressive. Excellent chakra control, Sakura. You should focus your training on techniques that make the most of that. Genjutsu, medical ninjutsu, precision-based jutsu. That's a genuine gift. Sakura flushed, pleased and a little stunned by her own success, while beside her, two boys who very much did not want to be outperformed by the girl they'd both been quietly, or not so quietly, trying to impress stared up at the top of the tree with matching expressions of dawning horror. Sasuke went next. He made it about halfway before the bark beneath his feet exploded outward in a spray of splinters and he was forced to kick off and flip backward to avoid falling flat on his back. A controlled fall, at least, landing in a low crouch with his pride only mildly wounded. He stared at the gouge mark he'd left, jaw tight, already recalculating. Better than most first attempts, Kakashi observed. Try again with less chakra. And then it was Naruto's turn. He didn't walk to the tree so much as launch himself at it, sprinting full speed with a battle cry that startled a flock of birds out of the nearby canopy, and slammed both feet against the trunk with every ounce of chakra he could force through his coils at once. The tree didn't just crack. It detonated. A chunk of bark the size of a dinner plate blew off the trunk in a shower of splinters, and Naruto himself was thrown backward through the air like he'd stepped on a landmine, arms windmilling, before crashing into the dirt on his back with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. Sakura winced. That looked like it hurt. It did, Naruto said from the ground, staring up at the sky. A lot. Kakashi walked over, peering down at him with an expression that was somehow both sympathetic and completely unsurprised. You put your entire reserve into that. All at once, with no regulation. That's what I always do, Naruto said, sitting up and rubbing the back of his head. Overwhelming power! Big attacks! It's worked before. It works for techniques that reward raw output, Kakashi said. This isn't one of them. In fact, and I say this as someone who's genuinely curious, not as an insult, your reserves are unusually massive for your age, Naruto. Genin your age typically have a fraction of what you're carrying. That's actually part of the problem here. You're trying to regulate a fire hose using instincts built for a garden tap. So what? I just have too much power. That doesn't sound like a problem to me. It's a problem, Kakashi said, when you can't control the amount coming out. A shinobi who can't regulate their own chakra is a shinobi who telegraphs every move, exhausts themselves in minutes, and, in the worst cases, hurts themselves or their allies with their own strength. You have the tank of a much older, much more experienced shinobi. What you don't have yet is the valve. Naruto scowled at the tree, which was still smoking faintly from where bark had been blasted clean off in a jagged wound, exposing pale wood beneath. Then I'll get the valve, he said, jumping back to his feet with a stubborn set to his jaw that Kakashi, if he was being honest, found weirdly reassuring. Watch me. What followed was hours. Genuine, grueling hours, and if you've ever tried to learn a skill that punishes overconfidence and rewards patience, you already know how brutal that combination can be for someone whose entire personality runs on momentum. Sasuke climbed, fell, adjusted, climbed again, steadily inching his mark higher up the trunk with each attempt, his failures growing smaller and more controlled, his frustration masked, poorly, behind a wall of Uchiha composure that cracked a little more with every attempt that didn't quite reach the top. Sakura, having already conquered the basic exercise, split her time between practicing further refinement, trying to hold the position longer, trying to walk across a horizontal branch, and offering unsolicited advice to her teammates that neither of them particularly wanted but that Sasuke, at least, grudgingly incorporated. And Naruto. Naruto exploded off that tree trunk more times than anyone bothered to count. Some of the failures were almost comedic. He'd throw too little chakra and simply slide back down the bark on his rear, dignity thoroughly bruised. Others were more violent, chakra bursting outward unevenly, blasting chunks of wood loose, sending him tumbling. By midday there was a visible ring of scarred, splintered bark around the base of the tree that told the story of his progress, or lack of it, better than words could. But here's the thing about Naruto Uzumaki that this entire series exists to explore, and it's worth pausing on here, because it matters for everything that's about to happen. He does not stop. Somewhere around his 30th attempt, nobody was counting exactly, but it felt like somewhere in that neighborhood, Sasuke made it 3/4 of the way up the trunk before his control gave out, higher than he'd managed all day, and dropped down with something that was almost a smirk tugging at his mouth. "Guess I'm getting the hang of this," Sasuke said, not quite to Naruto, but clearly, unmistakably for Naruto's benefit. And something in Naruto's chest tightened. You have to understand what that moment meant to him. This wasn't just about a tree. It was never just about a tree, not for Naruto. Every single measurable contest between him and Sasuke Uchiha carried the weight of a lifetime spent being looked at like an afterthought. The dead last, the class clown, the kid nobody wanted on their team, standing next to the golden prodigy everyone assumed would surpass him without even trying. Sasuke didn't have to be cruel about it. He didn't even have to say anything. The gap just existed, quiet and constant, in every glance from a teacher, every murmur from a classmate, every time someone compared their names in the same sentence. And Naruto was so tired of being on the losing end of that comparison. He looked at the tree. At the scarred, splintered trunk, chewed up by dozens of his failed attempts. At Sasuke, catching his breath a few feet away, already turning to try again. Something hot and frustrated coiled in his stomach, and beneath it, quieter, older, harder to name, something that felt less like anger and more like grief. The grief of a kid who had spent years wondering what was actually wrong with him. Why the numbers on his tests never matched his effort. Why chakra control drills that came easily to his classmates felt, to him, like trying to hold water in cupped hands while someone shook the ground beneath his feet. I'm not going to lose this too, he thought. Not this. Not to him. He didn't consciously decide to push harder. That's important to understand, if you want to know how this whole story starts. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a controlled decision. It was the same thing that had always driven Naruto forward his whole life, pure, undiluted refusal to be left behind, channeled through a body that had never, not once, learned how to do anything by half measures. He sprinted at the tree again. This time, something was different. And even Naruto, mid-sprint, mid-frustration, mid-everything, felt it a half-second before his foot ever touched bark. A pressure behind his sternum, hot and sudden, like something deep in his chest had been quietly building all day and chose exactly this moment, this specific cocktail of frustration and desperation and wounded pride, to finally let go. His foot hit the trunk. And the world went strange for just a fraction of a second. Sakura would later describe it, when she talked about it at all, which wasn't often, because none of them fully understood what they'd seen, as a flash. A brief, orange-tinged shimmer along the bark where Naruto's foot connected, gone almost as soon as it appeared, swallowed by the explosion of splinters that followed a half-beat later as his chakra blew outward and threw him backward off the trunk exactly the way it had 30 times before. Except it wasn't exactly the way it had 30 times before. Because when Naruto hit the ground this time, rolling, groaning, blinking up at the canopy overhead with the particular disorientation of someone whose brain hadn't quite caught up with his body, nobody was looking at him. They were looking at the tree. Where the chunk of bark had blown outward wasn't just splintered pale wood, jagged and raw the way every other failed attempt had left it. It was black. A ragged, smoking scar of charred wood, curling faintly with thin gray wisps of smoke, the edges of the wound crisped and blistered like something had briefly, violently burned through the bark instead of simply cracking it apart. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Sakura was the first to find her voice, walking closer to the trunk with her brow furrowed in the particular way she got when something didn't fit the shape of what she expected the world to be. "Naruto, did you do that?" "Do what?" Naruto said, still lying on the ground, one arm thrown over his eyes against the sunlight. "I fell off the tree again, if that's what you're asking. Thanks for noticing." "No, I mean..." She crouched down, reaching a hand toward the blackened wood, stopping just short of touching it. "This is burned. Like actually burned, not just cracked apart. There's smoke coming off it." That got Naruto's attention. He sat up, rubbing dirt out of his hair, and squinted at the tree. His stomach did something complicated when he saw it. He'd fallen off that tree so many times in the last few hours that the sensation of failure had become almost background noise. A dull, familiar ache of frustration he mostly learned to shrug off and try again. But this felt different, even before he understood why. There was a strange, lingering warmth behind his ribs, faint but unmistakable, like the last echo of something that had briefly flared very hot very close to his heart. He pressed a hand flat against his chest without quite meaning to, frowning at the sensation. I didn't do anything different," he said slowly, more to himself than to Sakura. "I just ran at it like every other time." Sasuke had walked over now too, arms crossed, dark eyes narrowed at the scorched wood with an intensity that made Sakura glance nervously between him and Naruto. "That's not from Wind Nature chakra," he said quietly. "I don't know exactly what that is. But it's not what the rest of us have been doing to this tree all day." "Wind-natured chakra?" Naruto repeated. "What are you talking about? We're not doing anything with wind, we're just climbing." "Chakra doesn't come out of your body neutral, dead last," Sasuke said, with just enough of an edge that Naruto's face flushed hot with irritation, momentarily distracting him from the weirder problem at hand. "Every shinobi has a natural elemental affinity: wind, fire, water, earth, lightning. When you overload the tree climbing exercise, your chakra doesn't blow it apart randomly. It blows it apart in a pattern that matches your affinity. Splintering, cutting damage, that's usually a wind signature. That," he nodded at the blackened bark, "isn't." "How do you even know that stuff?" Naruto muttered, but there was less heat in it now, because even he could feel that something genuinely strange had just happened, and it was starting to worm its way past his usual instinct to argue first and think later. And that was the exact moment Kakashi arrived. He'd been a short distance away, technically supervising, technically resting, leaning against a tree with his ever-present orange book held loosely in one hand, visible eye occasionally flicking up to check on his students between paragraphs. He liked to let them work through frustration on their own before stepping in. It built character, in his experience, more reliably than constant hovering ever did. But the moment that scent hit the air, faint, sharp, unmistakably the smell of something scorched rather than merely broken, his head came up fast, book forgotten mid-sentence, single eye locking onto the tree with an intensity that made all three genin fall silent just from the shift in his posture. He crossed the distance in a handful of unhurried steps that somehow covered ground far faster than they should have, and crouched at the base of the trunk, studying the blackened wound with a stillness that felt, to the three genin watching him, distinctly out of character. Kakashi Hatake did not do stillness. Kakashi Hatake did lazy, unbothered, perpetually late with a vague excuse. This was something else. "Sensei?" Sakura ventured, when the silence stretched a beat too long. "Is something wrong?" "No," Kakashi said, a half-second too quickly, straightening up and turning his single visible eye toward Naruto with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing, which, if you knew Kakashi at all, was itself a tell. "Nothing's wrong. Naruto, that was your attempt?" "Yeah," Naruto said, still rubbing his sore back, oblivious to the careful weight in Kakashi's tone. Same as every other time. I ran at it, put chakra in my feet, and blew myself off again. Nothing special. Kakashi looked back at the tree for a long beat. Then, with the casual, unbothered tone of a man discussing the weather rather than something that had just made his stomach drop, he said, Well, progress is progress, however it looks. Take a break, all of you. It's nearly midday, and Tizuna's daughter mentioned something about lunch. Sakura and Sasuke exchanged a glance, the specific glance of two people who had both noticed their sensei's reaction and both silently agreed it was strange, without either of them quite having the vocabulary yet to say why, but neither pushed the issue. Kakashi had a way of closing conversations that made further questions feel pointless before you'd even ask them. Naruto, characteristically, was already halfway to forgetting about it, more focused on the growl in his stomach than the mystery of the scorched bark. Food! Finally, I'm starving. I feel like I've been climbing that stupid tree for 100 years. You have been, Sasuke said dryly, already walking toward the house. Badly. Hey! The two of them bickered their way back across the yard, Sakura trailing after them with a small, exasperated smile despite herself, the strange scorch mark on the tree already fading from the front of her mind in the way small mysteries tend to when there's food and familiar bickering to distract from them. Kakashi didn't follow immediately. He stayed where he was for a moment longer, alone at the base of the tree, and reached out to lightly touch two fingers against the charred edge of the wound in the bark. It was still faintly warm. Genuinely, physically warm, not from the sun, not from friction, but from something that had briefly, unmistakably burned there less than a minute ago. He'd seen a lot of things in his life. He'd copied over 1,000 jutsu with the eye currently resting beneath his headband. He knew what wind-natured chakra damage looked like. He'd seen Naruto blast bark apart in exactly that fashion 24 times already that morning, clean, sharp, characteristic cutting splinters. This wasn't that. This was fire. And Naruto Uzumaki, as far as Kakashi Hatake had ever been told, as far as any file in the Hokage's records had ever indicated, did not have a fire affinity. He had wind. Confirmed, tested, unremarkable in its category if not in its raw volume. Wind, full stop. That was the affinity every academy record, every Jonin assessment, every scrap of information Kakashi had ever seen about Naruto Uzumaki's chakra nature agreed on. So what, exactly, had just happened to that tree? Kakashi straightened up slowly, glancing across the yard to where his students had disappeared into Tizuna's house, laughter and bickering audible even from this distance. His expression, for just a moment, with no one around to see it, shifted into something unusually serious. Thoughtful. A little unsettled, in the specific way a man gets unsettled when a puzzle piece he didn't know existed suddenly clicks somewhere it shouldn't logically fit. Dual affinity, he thought. That's exceptionally rare. Rare enough that I've only ever read about it, never actually seen it. And if it's real, if what I just saw was really what I think it was. He didn't finish the thought out loud. He didn't need to. Because underneath the surprise, underneath the professional curiosity of a shinobi who'd spent his whole life cataloging jutsu and techniques and rare bloodline quirks, there was something quieter and more careful stirring in the back of Kakashi's mind. If Naruto really did have a second, hidden elemental affinity, one buried deep enough that it had never surfaced in any of the standard tests the academy or the village had ever run on him, that wasn't just an interesting quirk. That was information. The kind of information that, in the wrong hands, in front of the wrong people, could turn a loud, clumsy, big-hearted 12-year-old into a target. Konoha's council had a long, uncomfortable history of treating rare bloodline traits less like a gift and more like property, something to be catalogued, controlled, potentially bred or weaponized depending on which faction got their hands on the information first. And that was before you even factored in Naruto's other, far more dangerous secret. The one sealed behind his navel, the one that made half the village flinch at the sight of him without ever quite explaining why. A boy carrying the nine tails and a rare dual chakra nature was not a boy who needed more reasons for powerful people to take an interest in him. Kakashi glanced back down at the tree, at the ragged black scar cut into pale wood, and made a decision right there, standing alone in a quiet backyard in a country still recovering from tyranny. I need to see that again, he thought. Properly. Deliberately. Not by accident, and not where anyone else can watch. He tucked his book back into his vest pocket, for once, not particularly interested in finishing the chapter he'd been halfway through, and turned to follow his students back toward the house, already turning over exactly how he was going to have this conversation without alarming Naruto or tipping off Sasuke and Sakura before he understood what he was actually dealing with. Lunch was, by every outward appearance, a completely normal affair. Tazuna's daughter, Tsunami, had put together a modest spread, simple, practical food, the kind that stretched further than it looked, a reflection of a household that had spent years scraping by under Gato's economic stranglehold on the country. Naruto inhaled his portion with his usual enthusiasm, talking with his mouth full about how he was definitely going to beat that tree by tomorrow. Don't worry, believe it. Sasuke ate in his usual controlled silence, occasionally cutting in with a dry correction whenever Naruto's boasting drifted too far from reality. Sakura mediated between them with the exhausted patience of someone who'd appointed herself referee of this particular rivalry against her will. Tazuna's grandson, Inari, a quiet, sullen boy who'd spent most of the mission so far radiating a kind of bitter hopelessness that made even Naruto's boundless energy falter around him, sat near the edge of the table, picking at his food, saying little. At one point, when Naruto made an offhand comment about how they were all going to get strong enough to protect the bridge no matter what happened, Inari's face twisted into something sharp and dismissive. You don't get it, Inari muttered, not quite loud enough to be a challenge, but not quiet enough to be missed either. People like Gato always win. Heroes don't exist. Trying doesn't matter. The table went a little quiet. Naruto's expression did something complicated, flickered, for just a second, with something older and more tired than his usual grin, something that spoke to a childhood that had taught him more about loss and disappointment than any 12-year-old should know. But then it hardened into something stubborn. You don't know anything about me, Naruto said, not unkindly but firm. I've had plenty of reasons to think trying doesn't matter too. I decided a long time ago I wasn't gonna believe that. So don't tell me heroes don't exist. I'm gonna prove you wrong. Inari didn't respond to that. He just pushed back from the table and left the room without another word, and an uncomfortable silence lingered after him. Kakashi watched all of it, watched Naruto's jaw tighten, watched something raw and determined settle behind his eyes, and thought, not for the first time, that there was a lot more depth hiding behind that loud, brash exterior than most people ever bothered to notice. If he really does have a second affinity, Kakashi thought, watching Naruto stubbornly finish his food with more force than necessary, jaw still set from the exchange with Inari, it's not going to be an easy thing to teach him control over. Not with everything else he's already carrying. But that was a problem for tonight. For now, there was still an afternoon of training left, and, for the sake of not alarming three exhausted genin any further than necessary, Kakashi intended to let the rest of the day proceed exactly as normal. The afternoon session continued much as the morning had, on the surface. Sasuke kept climbing, kept falling, kept inching his mark a little higher with a stubbornness that mirrored his rivals more than either of them would have admitted out loud. Sakura moved on to trying to maintain her position on a branch for longer stretches, occasionally offering pointers that Sasuke absorbed and Naruto mostly ignored out of sheer wounded pride. And Naruto kept running at that tree. He fell off a dozens more times before the sun started sinking toward the horizon, and, much to his visible frustration, none of those attempts produced the strange scorch mark from before. Every fall after that first one blew bark apart in the same clean, splintering pattern as all his earlier attempts, sharp-edged and pale, no black char, no lingering smoke, no warmth behind his ribs. Kakashi, watching from a careful distance, noted the absence with quiet interest rather than disappointment. Emotional trigger, he thought, turning the pieces over in his mind. It happened when his frustration spiked hardest, right after Sasuke's comment. That tracks with what little I've read about latent secondary affinities. They tend to surface under duress before they surface on command. By the time the light had gone soft and orange through the trees, all three genin were exhausted, dirt-streaked, and thoroughly humbled by a tree that had, over the course of a single day, made fools of two of Konoha's most promising young shinobi and one increasingly determined dead last. Enough for today, Kakashi called, and nobody argued. They trudged back toward the house in the fading light, Sasuke silently reviewing the day's progress in his head, Sakura chattering quietly about dinner, Naruto lagging a few steps behind, unusually thoughtful for someone who spent most of his waking hours talking. He kept glancing back at the tree. Something about that moment, the flash, the warmth in his chest, the black scorch mark that had briefly appeared and then never showed up again no matter how hard he tried to replicate it, was nagging at the back of his mind in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He wasn't sure why it mattered so much. It was probably nothing. Probably just some weird fluke, some trick of the light, some coincidence born of exhaustion and frustration. But some small, quiet part of him, the same part that had spent his whole life being told he was ordinary at best, a failure at worst, couldn't quite let it go. What was that? Dinner passed uneventfully. Tsunami served a modest but warm meal. Tazuna grumbled about how much longer the bridge was going to take with Gato's thugs still circling the edges of the country, and the three genin ate with the particular hollowed-out hunger of kids who'd spent an entire day throwing themselves at a tree with everything they had. By the time everyone settled down for the evening, Sakura and Sasuke retreating to their respective corners of the house to rest, Tazuna's household drifting into its usual quiet routines, Naruto found himself lying on his sleeping mat, staring up at the ceiling, replaying that strange half-second flash over and over in his mind. He didn't hear the door slide open. He did, however, notice the shadow that fell across him a moment later, and sat up fast, half expecting an attack out of pure reflex before his brain caught up and recognized the familiar silhouette of gray hair and a slanted headband silhouetted in the doorway. "Kakashi-sensei?" he whispered, glancing past him toward the hallway, where Sasuke and Sakura's rooms were quiet and dark. "What's wrong? Is it Zabuza?" "No," Kakashi said quietly, stepping fully into the room and sliding the door shut behind him with a soft click. His single visible eye studied Naruto for a long moment in the dim light, something careful and unreadable in his expression. "Nothing's wrong. I just need you to come with me for a few minutes. Quietly. Don't wake the others." Naruto blinked, confusion and curiosity warring across his face in equal measure. "Right now? It's the middle of the night, what?" "It's important," Kakashi said. "And it's about what happened on that tree this morning." That got Naruto's full attention immediately, all traces of sleepiness gone in an instant. He sat up straighter, eyes sharpening. "You saw that too? I thought maybe I imagined it, or—" "I saw it," Kakashi said, and something in his tone, careful, deliberate, entirely unlike his usual lazy drawl, made the hair on the back of Naruto's neck stand up just slightly. "And I have a theory about what it means. But I need to see you do it again before I say anything else. Deliberately this time. Just the two of us." Naruto stared up at his sensei in the darkness, heart suddenly beating a little faster in his chest, that same strange warmth from earlier stirring quietly behind his ribs as if in anticipation. "Okay," he said slowly. "Yeah. Okay. Let's go." He climbed to his feet, grabbed his jacket off the floor, and followed his sensei out into the cool night air, completely unaware that in the next few minutes, everything he thought he knew about himself was about to change. Because somewhere out past the tree line, under a sky full of stars neither of them were paying attention to, Kakashi Hatake was about to ask his loudest, most reckless student to do something no one had ever asked him to do before. Try it again. On purpose. And neither of them had any idea yet just how much that single request was about to reshape everything that came next. What if Naruto secretly had a rare fire release affinity alongside wind? Chapter 2: The Second Nature. Last time, Kakashi Hatake pulled Naruto out of bed in the dead of night with 4 words that changed everything. It's about the tree. If you're just joining this series, here's where we left off. During a routine chakra control exercise in the Land of Waves, Naruto Uzumaki did something that should have been impossible. A single burst of frustration-fueled chakra didn't just splinter the bark of a training tree the way wind-natured chakra always had before, it burned it. Charred it black, curled smoke off the edges, left a wound in the wood that had no business existing on a boy whose only confirmed elemental affinity, according to every academy record and Jonin assessment ever run on him, was wind. Kakashi saw it. And Kakashi, unlike two exhausted, distracted genin more focused on beating each other than paying attention to smoke, understood immediately what he might be looking at. Now he's leading Naruto out into the dark, away from the house, away from Sasuke and Sakura's sleeping forms, toward a clearing deep enough in the woods that no one is going to stumble across whatever happens next by accident. Because if Kakashi's theory is right, what Naruto is carrying inside him isn't just rare. It's the kind of secret that could put a target on his back for the rest of his life. Stick around, because this is the chapter where everything changes, and if you're new here, now's a great time to hit subscribe, because this series is only getting started. Let's get into it. The forest at night in the Land of Waves had a different texture than it did during the day. By daylight it was thin, struggling, the kind of woodland that spoke to a country stripped of resources by years of Gado's economic stranglehold, sparse canopy, undergrowth that never quite filled in the way it should have. But at night, under a sky thick with stars and a moon just past full, it took on a hush that felt almost sacred, every rustle of leaves and snap of twig underfoot amplified in the stillness. Naruto followed a half-step behind his sensei, jacket thrown haphazardly over his sleep clothes, mind racing through a dozen half-formed questions he wasn't quite sure how to ask yet. Kakashi hadn't said much since waking him, just a quiet, deliberate pace through the trees, single visible eye scanning the darkness out of old habit, the kind of habit that came from a career spent assuming danger could be anywhere until proven otherwise. They walked for almost 10 minutes before Kakashi finally slowed, stepping into a modest clearing ringed by trees, moonlight pooling silver across a patch of open ground. It was far enough from the house that no light from Tazuna's windows reached them, far enough from the road that no patrol, friendly or otherwise, was likely to stumble across whatever was about to happen here. "This should do," Kakashi said, turning to face his student. "Far enough that if something goes wrong, nobody's going to see it before we're ready for them to." "Something goes wrong?" Naruto repeated, a flicker of nerves cutting through his curiosity. "Sensei, what exactly do you think happened back there? You've been acting weird about it since this morning." Kakashi studied him for a long moment, weighing, Naruto could tell, exactly how much to say and how to say it. It wasn't the look Naruto was used to seeing on his sensei's face. Kakashi's default expression toward his students tended to hover somewhere between amused detachment and lazy encouragement, the kind of look that made even life-or-death training feel oddly low stakes. This was different. This was careful. I have a theory, Kakashi said finally. And I want to test it before I explain it to you, because if I'm wrong, there's no point getting you excited about something that isn't real. And if I'm right. He paused. If I'm right, this is something we need to handle very carefully. Understood? Naruto's stomach did a slow, uneasy flip, but he nodded. Understood. Good. Kakashi reached into the pouch at his hip and pulled out a small square of paper, thin, pale, unremarkable at first glance. He held it out. Take this. Naruto took it, turning it over in his fingers. What is it? Chakra paper, Kakashi said. It's treated with a specific chemical compound extracted from a tree that only grows in a handful of locations, the same tree species Academy instructors use for elemental affinity testing when you first enroll. When you channel chakra into it, the paper reacts based on your elemental nature. Wind-natured chakra splits the paper down the middle. Fire burns it to ash. Lightning wrinkles it. Earth crumbles it into dirt. Water makes it damp. Wait, we did this at the academy, Naruto said, brow furrowing as he tried to summon the memory. I remember, mine split. Right down the middle, real clean. Iruka-sensei said that meant wind. That's exactly what the record says, Kakashi confirmed. Wind. Confirmed and documented. Which is exactly why what happened on that tree this morning doesn't add up, unless something else is happening underneath it. Go ahead. Channel chakra into the paper. Same as you would for the tree exercise, but controlled. Don't overload it like you did this morning. Just a steady, even flow. Naruto held the small square between two fingers, took a breath, and focused. For a second, nothing happened. Then the paper split cleanly down the center, exactly the way it had the first time he'd ever done this exercise back at the academy. Two neat halves fluttering apart in his grip, drifting to the grass at his feet. See? Naruto said, half relieved, half disappointed. Wind. Same as always. Maybe this morning really was just some weird fluke. Do it again, Kakashi said. But this time, I want you to think about how you felt right before it happened on the tree. Not the physical motion. The feeling. Whatever was going through your head in that exact moment. Naruto hesitated, another square of paper already produced from Kakashi's pouch and pressed into his hand. He closed his fingers around it, and let his mind drift back to that morning, the tree, the splintered bark, Sasuke's dry comment about getting the hang of it, the specific, familiar sting of being one step behind again. He remembered the tight, hot coil of frustration in his chest, the stubborn refusal that had driven him to sprint at that trunk one more time even though every muscle in his legs had already been screaming from 30 failed attempts before it. I'm not going to lose this too. Not to him. Not this. The paper in his hand grew warm. Naruto's eyes snapped open. He hadn't even realized he'd closed them, just in time to watch a thin curl of smoke rise off the edge of the paper before it burst into a small, sudden flame that consumed it entirely in the space of a heartbeat, leaving nothing but a scatter of gray ash drifting down onto the grass. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Naruto stared at his own empty fingers, ash sifting between them, mouth slightly open. His heart was pounding, not from exertion, but from something closer to shock, the specific, dizzying shock of watching your own body do something you didn't know it was capable of. Sensei, he said, voice smaller than usual. That's not wind. That's fire, Kakashi said quietly, and for once there was no lazy detachment in his voice at all. That's fire, Naruto. Naruto sat down hard in the grass, staring at the small pile of ash like it might explain itself if he looked hard enough. But that doesn't make sense, he said, shaking his head. I'm wind. I've always been wind. That's what the test said, that's what Iruka-sensei told me, that's what's in my file. It's not wrong, Kakashi said, crouching down across from him, elbows resting on his knees, expression thoughtful in the moonlight. Your primary affinity is wind. That test wasn't lying to you. But what just happened tells me something else is buried underneath it, a secondary affinity that's never surfaced under normal testing conditions, because normal testing conditions don't put you under the kind of emotional pressure that seems to trigger it. A secondary affinity, Naruto repeated slowly, testing the words out like they belonged to someone else's life. Is that a normal thing? Do lots of people have that? Kakashi shook his head, and something in the gravity of that small motion made Naruto's stomach tighten all over again. No, Kakashi said. It's not normal. Most shinobi have exactly one natural elemental affinity for their entire lives. The one that comes easiest, the one that requires the least effort to manifest and control. A smaller number can eventually learn to use a second nature through years of dedicated training, the way I use several through the Sharingan's copying ability, or the way certain elite jonin train themselves into it over a career. But that's learned. Trained. Built through years of deliberate effort. He paused, watching Naruto carefully. What you just did wasn't learned. It came out on its own, under stress, with zero training behind it whatsoever. That's not a second affinity you're developing, Naruto. That's a second affinity that's already there. One you were apparently born with, that simply never had a reason to surface until today. Naruto sat with that for a long moment, the cool night air settling around them, crickets filling the silence neither of them was in a hurry to break. Is that a good thing? He asked finally, some of the wonder in his voice edged now with uncertainty. It sounds like a good thing. Like that's an advantage, right? 2 elements instead of 1? It can be, Kakashi said carefully. In the right circumstances, with the right training, having 2 natural affinities is an enormous asset. Most jutsu are built around a single elemental foundation. A shinobi who can genuinely wield 2 natures fluently has access to a much broader toolkit, and more importantly, has the theoretical foundation to eventually combine those 2 natures into something else entirely. Combine them how? Naruto asked, leaning forward despite himself, curiosity starting to override the unease. Kakashi hesitated, just slightly, just long enough that Naruto noticed, before answering. There's a concept in advanced elemental theory called Kekkei Toda, he said. Techniques that arise from blending 2, sometimes 3, base chakra natures together into something new, something that isn't simply wind, or simply fire, but a third thing entirely, with its own unique properties. Most of these bloodline techniques are exceptionally rare, usually confined to specific clans who've cultivated and passed them down for generations. I've read about a technique called Scorch Release, a fusion specifically of wind and fire natures, that produces an intensely destructive, superheated jutsu category. Extreme heat combined with wind-driven force and reach. It's associated with only a small handful of known practitioners in recorded history. Naruto's eyes had gone wide somewhere in the middle of that explanation. Wait, he said. Wind and fire. That's exactly what I have. Are you saying I could learn that? That scorch thing? I'm saying it's theoretically possible, Kakashi said, with the careful precision of a man choosing every word deliberately. Having both natural affinities is the prerequisite. It doesn't guarantee you'd be able to develop a working Kekkei Toda technique. That would require years of dedicated, specialized training, likely well beyond what I'm personally equipped to teach you. But the fact that you have both natures, apparently at a genuinely usable level even without training, puts you in an extremely rare category of shinobi. Rare enough that I don't think I've ever personally met anyone else who fits it. There was a beat of silence. Then Naruto's face split into the widest grin Kakashi had seen on him in days, all traces of uncertainty momentarily forgotten in a flood of pure, uncomplicated excitement. That's awesome. Why do you look so serious about this? This is the best news I've gotten in. Because it's dangerous, Naruto. The words cut through his excitement like a blade, flat and serious in a way that made Naruto's grin falter and die. Kakashi held his gaze, steady and unflinching, in the moonlight. Think about what I just told you, he said. You have a rare, unusual chakra trait that almost nobody else in Konoha possesses. Do you understand what happens to information like that once it reaches the wrong ears? Naruto's excitement curdled slowly into something more uncertain. What do you mean, the wrong ears? Who would even care? Konoha's council, Kakashi said. Some of its more ambitious clans. Certain individuals within the village who make it their business to catalog and control every asset that might one day prove useful to them, regardless of what that asset wants for itself. You already carry one enormous secret that the council has strong opinions about, whether or not you fully understand the shape of those opinions yet. Adding a second one, a rare bloodline-adjacent chakra trait, on top of everything else you already are, is not something I'm willing to hand over lightly. Naruto's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted, a flicker of old, familiar hurt surfacing beneath the excitement, the specific ache of a boy who'd spent his whole life being looked at sideways for reasons nobody would fully explain to him. He knew, in the vague, half-formed way a 12-year-old understands things adults dance around, that there was more to why the village treated him the way it did than simple dislike of a loud troublemaker. He just didn't know the full shape of it yet. And Kakashi wasn't about to be the one to hand him that particular truth tonight, either, not when there was already so much else to process. So what? Naruto said finally, voice tight. You're saying I should just hide it? Pretend it doesn't exist? I'm saying we keep it quiet, Kakashi said, gentler now, recognizing the hurt underneath the frustration. For now. Not forever. Not because there's anything wrong with you, or anything shameful about what you can do, quite the opposite, honestly. But because you deserve the chance to grow into this ability on your own terms, at your own pace, before anyone with an agenda gets the chance to decide what to do with you because of it. That's not me telling you to be ashamed of who you are. That's me trying to protect you. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his own hands in the moonlight, turning the words over. You really think people would try to use it against me? He asked finally, quieter than before. Or use me because of it? Kakashi's expression, for just a moment, was unusually open, none of his usual guarded amusement, just plain, honest concern. I think Konoha is full of good people, Naruto. I also think it's full of people who see potential and instinctively want to control it rather than nurture it. I'd rather you have the chance to become strong on your own terms before you're forced to navigate that. That's all I'm asking. Something in that landed differently than Naruto expected. He braced for the conversation to feel like every other time in his life he'd been told to be smaller, quieter, less himself for reasons nobody bothered explaining. But this didn't feel like that. This felt like someone actually trying to look out for him, trying, in his own careful, roundabout way, to give Naruto something rare, a choice, and time to make it on his own terms. He let out a slow breath. Okay, he said. Okay, I get it. I won't tell Sasuke or Sakura. Or Tazuna, or anybody. But, he looked up, something stubborn and bright reasserting itself behind his eyes. You're gonna teach me, right? Not just hide it. Actually teach me how to use it. The corner of Kakashi's visible eye crinkled, something like real warmth returning to his expression for the first time since this conversation had started. That's exactly the plan. Which is why we're out here in the middle of the night instead of me simply telling you to bury it and forget about it. No. He straightened up, offering Naruto a hand to help him to his feet. Let's see how much control you actually have over this, before we get ahead of ourselves. What followed over the next hour was, by any measure, a mess. Kakashi started simply, asked Naruto to try producing a small, controlled flame at the tip of one finger, the way a novice fire-natured shinobi might begin their earliest lessons. It sounded straightforward enough in theory. In practice, Naruto's chakra control had never been the issue-free asset that Sasuke's or Sakura's was, and applying that same unrefined, overwhelming force to an entirely new nature he never consciously used before produced results that ranged from disappointing to mildly alarming. His first several attempts produced nothing at all, a faint, frustrating warmth in his fingertips that never coalesced into anything visible, no matter how hard he concentrated. Naruto's scowl deepened with each failed attempt, muscle memory clearly reaching for something familiar to grip onto, and finding nothing. "It's not working like it did with the paper," he complained, shaking out his hand like that might dislodge whatever was blocking him. "Back there it just happened. Now I'm trying and nothing's coming out." "That's not unusual," Kakashi said, arms crossed, watching with the patient, evaluating gaze of someone who'd taught plenty of frustrated students before. What happened with the tree, and again with the second piece of paper, both occurred under emotional pressure, genuine, spontaneous stress response. You weren't thinking about the mechanics of producing fire. You were reacting. Deliberately trying to summon it on command, calm and controlled, engages a completely different part of your mind. It's a common hurdle for anyone developing a new affinity. Try channeling the same emotional trigger you used with the paper. Recreate the feeling, not just the technique. Naruto closed his eyes, dragging his thoughts back to that hot coil of frustration from the tree exercise, the sting of Sasuke's comment, the exhaustion, the stubborn refusal to be left behind. It took a moment to fully summon it here, calm and deliberate under a quiet night sky rather than in the heat of the moment, but slowly, he felt that familiar warmth building behind his ribs again. He focused it toward his hand. This time, a small, unsteady flame flickered to life at his fingertip, weak, guttering, clearly costing him significant effort to maintain, but undeniably real. Naruto's eyes flew open, staring at the tiny flame dancing above his own finger like he half expected it to vanish the second he acknowledged it. "I did it," he breathed. "Sensei, look, I actually..." The flame guttered out. "Had it," he finished, deflating slightly, though the grin on his face didn't fully fade. "That was so cool though. Did you see that?" "I saw it," Kakashi confirmed, something genuinely pleased in his tone despite the brevity of the result. "That's an excellent start, honestly. Most shinobi need considerably longer than one attempt to produce their first controlled flame with an entirely untrained affinity. Try again. Focus on sustaining it a little longer this time, rather than just producing it." They worked through it for the better part of an hour. Naruto's progress was inconsistent. Some attempts produced nothing, some produced brief unstable flickers that died within seconds, and a couple of attempts, when his frustration at his own inconsistency spiked hard enough, produced small bursts that flared too large too fast, forcing him to yelp and shake his hand out before he singed himself. "Careful," Kakashi said dryly, after one such incident left a faint scorch mark on Naruto's sleeve. "Fire doesn't discriminate between the tree you're trying to burn and your own hand, if you lose control of it." "Yeah, I'm noticing that," Naruto muttered, inspecting the small burn mark on his cuff with a rueful expression. "This is a lot harder than the tree climbing thing." "It should be," Kakashi said. "You're not just learning a new skill. You're learning to consciously access and shape an entire chakra nature your body has apparently been quietly carrying your entire life without you knowing it existed. That's not something anyone masters in a single night. This is the beginning of a very long process." Naruto flexed his singed fingers, staring down at them with an expression that had shifted, somewhere over the course of the last hour, from simple excitement into something more complicated, a kind of dawning, serious wonder, the look of someone realizing that the thing they just discovered about themselves was bigger, and would demand more of them, than they'd initially understood. "Sensei," he said slowly. Why me? I mean, why would I have this and nobody's ever noticed before? Doesn't stuff like this usually run in families? Like clans and stuff? It was, Kakashi thought, an uncomfortably perceptive question for someone who had absolutely no memory of either of his parents, and no idea just how loaded a question about inherited traits actually was for him specifically. Kakashi chose his next words with care. Elemental affinities generally do have hereditary components, he said. Though not always in predictable ways, sometimes a trait skips generations, or surfaces unexpectedly through a combination of lineages that wouldn't obviously suggest it. Your specific case is, he paused, harder to explain than most, given the limited records available about your family history. Naruto's expression flickered, a familiar, practiced blankness sliding over his face, the particular defense mechanism of a kid who'd learned young not to hope too hard for answers about his own past that nobody ever seemed willing or able to give him. Yeah, he said, a little too casually. I figured. It's fine, I'm used to not knowing stuff like that. Something about the deliberate lightness in his voice made Kakashi's chest tighten uncomfortably. He knew, better than almost anyone else currently alive, in fact, exactly whose son was standing in front of him, exactly what kind of legacy Naruto was quietly, unknowingly carrying. And he knew, with equal certainty, that revealing any of it here, now, in the middle of an already emotionally loaded night, would be catastrophically premature. That truth belonged to Hiruzen to reveal, when the timing was right, when Naruto was old enough and safe enough for the weight of it. But it didn't make watching Naruto brush off his own missing history with practiced, defensive nonchalance any easier to witness. For what it's worth, Kakashi said quietly, whatever the source of this ability turns out to be, it doesn't change what you've already shown me tonight. You picked up conscious control over an entirely new chakra nature faster than most trained shinobi manage. That's not luck, and it's not some accident of birth doing all the work for you. That's you? Naruto looked up at him, something raw and grateful flickering behind the deliberate casualness he tried to maintain a moment before. Thanks, Sensei, he said, quieter than his usual volume. Don't thank me yet, Kakashi said, the familiar lazy amusement creeping back into his tone as he pushed off the tree he'd been leaning against. We've got a lot more work ahead of us before you're doing anything with this ability that isn't liable to singe your own eyebrows off. One more attempt, and then we head back before Sakura wakes up and notices you're missing. The final attempt of the night turned out to be the one that mattered most, not because it produced anything spectacular, but because of what it revealed about the shape of the road ahead. Naruto closed his eyes, steadied his breathing, and reached for that familiar hot coil of frustration and determination one more time, except this time, without quite meaning to, his focus drifted. He thought not just about Sasuke's comment from that morning, but about the tree climbing exercise itself, about the specific frustration of trying to hold chakra steady beneath his feet. Without any conscious decision to do so, he pushed both instincts at once, the familiar cutting pressure of wind chakra he'd used 100 times before, and the new, unfamiliar warmth of fire he'd only just discovered, toward the same point at the same moment. The result wasn't fire. It wasn't wind either. For a fraction of a second, the air around his outstretched palm shimmered with a strange, distorted heat haze, and a faint whistling hiss cut through the quiet clearing, something that sounded, for just an instant, like a gust of superheated wind rather than either element on its own. Before the whole thing collapsed in on itself with an unstable pop that knocked Naruto backward off his feet and left a faint singed patch of grass smoking gently where his hand had been pointed. Kakashi was at his side in an instant, crouching down, checking him over with sharp, focused urgency. Naruto! Are you hurt? I'm fine, Naruto groaned, blinking up at the stars, more startled than injured. What was that? That wasn't just fire, that felt different. Kakashi's single visible eye had gone very still, staring down at his student with an expression that was equal parts alarm and something that looked almost like awe. "That," he said slowly, "was you trying to use both natures at the same time. Untrained. Completely by instinct." "Is that bad?" Naruto asked, sitting up gingerly, rubbing the back of his head where he'd landed. "It's early," Kakashi said with heavy emphasis. "Extremely early. What you just attempted, consciously or not, is exactly the kind of chakra layering that theoretically underlies something like scorch release. The fact that you produced any visible reaction at all on your very first attempt tonight is honestly remarkable. It's also completely uncontrolled and could genuinely hurt you if you keep pushing at it without proper structure. That's a technique that takes most theoretical practitioners years to approach safely, assuming they ever manage it at all." Naruto stared at his own hand, flexing his fingers slowly, that strange lingering warmth from earlier still humming faintly beneath his skin. "But I could do it," he said, something fierce and quiet kindling behind his eyes. "Eventually. Right? If I train hard enough?" Kakashi studied him for a long moment, this loud, reckless, endlessly stubborn boy who'd spent his entire short life being told, one way or another, that he wasn't enough. Not smart enough, not skilled enough, not worth the same attention or faith the village handed out freely to kids like Sasuke Uchiha. And here he was, 12 years old, sitting in scorched grass in the middle of the night, already reaching past the very edge of what Kakashi had told him was possible, simply because someone had finally given him an honest shot at it. "I think," Kakashi said carefully, "that if anyone I've ever trained has the sheer stubbornness necessary to eventually pull that off, it's you. But it's going to take real time, real structure, and real patience. Patience, I know, isn't exactly your strongest skill. Can you commit to that? Slow, deliberate, careful progress, even when every instinct in you wants to just throw everything you have at the problem all at once." Naruto's jaw set in that familiar, determined line Kakashi had already come to recognize over these past few weeks. The specific expression that meant a decision had been made and wasn't going to be argued out of him. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that. I'll do whatever it takes." "Good," Kakashi said, straightening up and offering a hand to pull his student to his feet. "Because we're doing this properly, Naruto. Careful sessions, late at night or early morning, away from Sasuke and Sakura, away from anyone who might ask questions we're not ready to answer. No showing off. No slipping up during team exercises. This has to stay contained until we understand exactly what we're dealing with, for your own protection, understand?" "I get it," Naruto said, and this time there was no hesitation in it at all. "I won't mess it up. Believe it." Kakashi allowed himself a small, genuine smile at that, the familiar phrase landing with more weight than usual, given everything that had just changed between them tonight. "Let's head back," he said. "It's late, and we've got a bridge to keep protecting come morning. This conversation doesn't leave this clearing, understood? Not to Sasuke. Not to Sakura. Not even to Tazuna's household, however friendly they've been to us." "Understood," Naruto said firmly, and fell into step beside his sensei as they made their way back through the dark trees toward the house, the events of the last hour settling into something that felt, despite the exhaustion and the singed sleeve and the faint ringing in his ears from that final unstable burst, unmistakably like the beginning of something enormous. They slipped back into the house without waking anyone, Naruto easing the door to his room shut behind him with exaggerated care before collapsing onto his sleeping mat, staring up at the ceiling with wide, wired-awake eyes despite the exhaustion dragging at every muscle in his body. Fire, he thought, turning the word over and over like something precious he wasn't quite ready to put down yet. I've got fire. And wind. Both. Nobody else has that. Not Sasuke. Not anybody. For the first time in longer than he could easily remember, Naruto Uzumaki fell asleep not thinking about everything he lacked compared to the people around him, but about something rare and entirely his own, something nobody had handed him, nobody could take credit for, that had simply been waiting quietly inside him his whole life for the right moment to finally show itself. He had no way of knowing, drifting off into an uneasy, excited sleep, just how soon that secret was going to be tested again, not in a quiet clearing under a careful sensei's supervision, but in the middle of a real fight, against real enemies, with no time to think and no room for mistakes. Because Zabuza Momochi wasn't finished with the Land of Waves yet. And neither, as it would turn out, was Haku. What if Naruto secretly had a rare fire release affinity alongside wind? Chapter 3: Training in the Off Hours. Last time, in the dead of night, Kakashi Hatake confirmed what a scorched patch of bark had already hinted at. Naruto Uzumaki wasn't just wind-natured. He was carrying a second, dormant chakra affinity, fire, buried so deep inside him that not even the Academy's standard testing had ever caught a hint of it. And for one brief, unstable moment, under nothing but raw instinct and desperation, he'd even brushed up against something far rarer than either nature on its own, the faint, chaotic echo of scorch release, a bloodline transfusion technique that most shinobi never so much as glimpse in an entire career. But knowing you can do something and actually controlling it are two very different problems. And if you've been following this series, you already know Naruto Uzumaki has never been the most patient student in any classroom he's ever sat in. Which is exactly the problem this chapter is about to explore. Because secrets are only secrets as long as nobody stumbles across them by accident. And when you're training an explosive, half-understood new ability in the middle of the night, a few dozen yards from two of the most perceptive genin in your entire graduating class, by accident, is a lot closer than anyone would like. If you're new to this series, now's a great time to hit subscribe, because this arc only gets more dangerous from here. Let's get into it. Morning came too early. Naruto woke to the familiar sound of Sakura's voice cutting through the haze of sleep, not shouting this time, just a low, exasperated mutter about how he always looked like he'd been dragged behind a cart even on days he'd apparently slept fine, and cracked one eye open to find sunlight already streaming through the paper screen door, far higher in the sky than he would have liked. His whole body ached in ways that had nothing to do with yesterday's tree-climbing failures. There was a dull, unfamiliar soreness behind his ribs, like a muscle he'd never known existed had been worked hard for the first time, and his fingertips still carried the faint, ghost memory tingle of heat from the night before. "You look terrible," Sakura observed, crouching beside his sleeping mat with her arms crossed. "Did you even sleep?" "I slept plenty," Naruto lied, sitting up and rubbing his eyes with more force than necessary, trying to will the exhaustion out of his skull through sheer stubbornness. "I'm always this good looking in the morning, you're just not used to appreciating it yet." Sakura's expression flattened into pure, unimpressed disbelief. "Sure. Whatever you say. Kakashi-sensei wants us out back in 10 minutes, so hurry up." She left before he could think of a comeback, which was probably for the best, because Naruto's brain was still running about half speed, caught somewhere between the lingering exhaustion of a night spent throwing unstable fire chakra around a forest clearing and the electric, restless excitement of a secret he desperately wanted to talk about and absolutely couldn't. He caught sight of Kakashi through the window a few minutes later, already outside, orange book in hand, looking, as far as Naruto could tell, completely unaffected by the fact that he too had been up half the night. Naruto scowled faintly at that unfairness, dragged himself upright, and went to get dressed. One secret. Just gotta keep one secret. How hard can that actually be? If you've been paying attention to this series so far, you already know exactly how hard that's about to turn out to be. The morning's training resumed more or less where the previous day had left off, tree climbing drills, incremental progress, the same familiar rhythm of Sasuke inching his mark higher with grim determination, Sakura refining control she'd already mostly mastered, and Naruto throwing himself at the trunk over and over with a slightly more measured approach than the day before. The measured part, notably, was new. He noticed it himself somewhere around his fifth attempt of the morning, a strange, deliberate awareness of which chakra he was pushing toward his feet, a faint, careful discipline he hadn't possessed 24 hours earlier. It wasn't perfect. He still overshot more often than not, still occasionally blasted himself backward off the trunk in a spray of splinters exactly the way he had the day before. But there was a difference in the quality of his failures now, smaller margins, tighter control, the faint, unmistakable signature of someone whose relationship with his own chakra had shifted overnight in some fundamental way, even if he couldn't have explained exactly how. Sasuke noticed too, though he said nothing about it directly, just watched, dark eyes narrowed with the particular calculating focus he reserved for anything that threatened to close a gap he'd assumed was permanent, filing the observation away without comment. Kakashi, watching from his usual spot with his book held loosely and mostly unread, allowed himself a small, private note of satisfaction. Better control over wine chakra wasn't the goal of last night's session, strictly speaking, but it made a certain kind of sense. You couldn't spend an hour deliberately distinguishing between two different chakra natures inside your own body without gaining some incidental precision over both of them in the process. Good, he thought. Unintended side benefit. That should help mask the real training, if anyone asks why he's suddenly a little sharper than yesterday. By midday, all three genin had made visible progress. Sasuke had finally cracked 2/3 of the way up the trunk without losing his footing. Sakura had begun experimenting with walking along horizontal branches to test her control under different angles, and Naruto, while still trailing both of them in raw success rate, had at least stopped blowing himself entirely off the tree on every single attempt. "We're close," Kakashi announced, as the three of them gathered, sweaty and dirt-streaked, for a brief midday break. "A few more days at this pace, and all three of you should have functional mastery of the exercise. Which is good, because that control forms the foundation for a great deal of what comes next in your training, and more immediately, for staying alive if Zabuza decides he's recovered enough to try again." The mention of Zabuza settled a familiar tension over the group, a reminder, if any of them had needed one, that this wasn't just an ordinary training exercise in an ordinary place. Somewhere out there, an S-rank missing nin was recovering from a fight that had nearly killed him, alongside a partner whose skill with Senbon and Ice had come uncomfortably close to matching Kakashi's own Sharingan. "How long do you think he needs?" Sakura asked quietly. "To recover, I mean." "Hard to say precisely," Kakashi admitted. "Longer than a few days, certainly. Shorter than a few weeks, probably. Which is exactly why we're not wasting a single day of the time we have." Naruto, listening to this exchange, felt that familiar coil of tension settle in his chest, not fear exactly, but a kind of charged readiness, the awareness that whatever was coming, he wanted to be stronger than he'd been on that bridge the first time. Stronger not just in the general, vague sense of more training, but specifically, urgently, in the ways that might actually matter when Zabuza came back and things got desperate again. He thought about the flame he'd summoned at his fingertip the night before. About that strange, unstable burst of heat-hazed wind that had knocked him flat on his back. If I can get better at that, he thought, maybe next time I won't just be the guy who gets thrown around until Kakashi-sensei bails everyone out. The afternoon session wound down with the sun sinking low and golden through the trees, and by the time dinner rolled around, all three genin were thoroughly exhausted in the specific, satisfying way that came from a day of genuine progress rather than wasted effort. Dinner itself passed in familiar rhythms. Tsunami's cooking, modest and practical as always, disappeared quickly under the appetites of three growing shinobi. Tazuna grumbled about supply shortages and Gato's continued interference with the bridge's construction materials. Inari sat quietly at the edge of the table, saying little, though Naruto noticed, with a flicker of something that might have been quiet satisfaction, that the boy seemed a shade less openly hostile than he had the day before, watching Naruto's exhausted, dirt-streaked determination with something that looked almost like grudging curiosity rather than outright dismissal. By the time the household settled into its evening routines, Sasuke and Sakura retreating to rest with the specific heaviness of genin who'd earned every hour of sleep they were about to get, Naruto found himself lying on his sleeping mat once again, staring at the ceiling, waiting. He didn't have to wait long. The door slid open with the same soft, careful click as the night before, Kakashi's familiar silhouette framed in the dim light of the hallway. "Ready?" Kakashi asked quietly. Naruto was already sitting up, energy flooding back into his exhausted limbs at the prospect of what came next. Exhaustion be damned. "Ready." The same clearing waited for them, moonlight pooling silver across the grass, the faint scorched patch from the night before still visible if you knew exactly where to look for it. Naruto dropped into a loose stance almost automatically, some part of him already anticipating the structure of tonight's session before Kakashi had said a word. "Before we start," Kakashi said, "I want to establish something important. Last night was about confirming what you're capable of. Tonight is about control. That means slower, more deliberate, less throwing everything you have at the problem and hoping something sticks." "I can do slow," Naruto said, with the particular confidence of someone who had never actually demonstrated an ability to do slow in his entire life. Kakashi's visible eye crinkled faintly with something that might have been amusement, might have been doubt, possibly both. "We'll see. Start with the same exercise from last night, a small, controlled flame at your fingertip. But this time, I want you to hold it. Not for a burst of a second or two. Sustain it. Focus on maintaining a steady, even flow rather than a single dramatic release." Naruto closed his eyes, reaching for that same hot coil of feeling from the night before, though tonight, without the fresh sting of Sasuke's comment to draw on, he had to work a little harder to summon the right emotional trigger. He settled, eventually, on the memory of Sasuke's tree-climbing progress from that very morning, the small, satisfied set of his rival's jaw as he'd cracked 2/3 of the way up the trunk. It wasn't as sharp as yesterday's fresh frustration, but it was enough, a familiar, well-worn groove of "I have to keep up, I can't fall behind" that Naruto had been carving into himself for years. A small flame flickered to life at his fingertip. This time, instead of guttering out within seconds, it held, unsteady, flickering, clearly costing him real effort to maintain, but genuinely sustained for several long seconds before finally dying out on its own. "Better," Kakashi said, and there was real approval in his voice. "Do it again. Try to extend it a little longer each time." They worked through it methodically over the next half hour, Naruto summoning small, controlled flames, holding them for progressively longer stretches, occasionally losing control and either extinguishing the flame prematurely or flaring it too large and having to shake out a lightly singed hand. Kakashi corrected his posture, his breathing, the specific mental discipline required to maintain steady output rather than the explosive, all-or-nothing bursts that came naturally to him. It was, by any measure, slow, unglamorous, repetitive work, the kind of training montage that never makes it into the exciting parts of anyone's origin story, but forms the actual, unremarkable foundation underneath every impressive technique a shinobi ever masters. And Naruto, to his own genuine surprise, found he didn't mind it nearly as much as he'd expected to. There was something quietly satisfying about it, actually, a kind of focus he rarely got to experience in his usual chaotic, reactive approach to everything else in his life. No opponent to overpower through sheer stubbornness. No audience to perform for. Just him, a small flame, and the patient, deliberate work of learning to hold something steady instead of throwing it as hard as he could and hoping for the best. "You're doing well," Kakashi said, after Naruto managed to sustain a flame for nearly a full minute without losing control. Genuinely well. Most shinobi need considerably longer to develop this level of sustained control over an entirely new affinity. Naruto grinned, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead despite the cool night air. Told you I could do slow. You've done slow for exactly 40 minutes, Kakashi said dryly. Let's see how you handle the next part before you get too confident. There's a next part? There's always a next part, Kakashi said, and something in his tone made Naruto's stomach flutter with anticipation. Tonight, I want to introduce a small amount of shape manipulation. Not just producing a flame, directing it. Extending it outward from your palm rather than simply holding it at your fingertip. This is the foundational step toward anything resembling an actual offensive technique. Naruto's eyes lit up. Like an actual jutsu? A fire jutsu? A very, very early version of the theoretical foundation for one, Kakashi said, with the specific caution of a teacher trying to manage expectations before they ran too far ahead of reality. Don't expect a fireball technique tonight. Expect a small, controlled extension of flame a few inches beyond your palm, if you're lucky and disciplined about it. Understood? Understood, Naruto said, already settling into a focused stance, some of his usual restless energy channeled, for once, into genuine concentration rather than scattered enthusiasm. The next attempts were harder, noticeably, frustratingly harder, and it didn't take long for Naruto's patient composure to start fraying at the edges. Extending the flame outward from his palm required a different kind of control than simply sustaining it at his fingertip, a more active, directional push of chakra that his body, still fundamentally more comfortable with the explosive, all-at-once instincts of raw wind release, kept fighting against. His first several attempts either failed to extend at all, the flame guttering weakly against his palm without moving anywhere, or overcorrected wildly, flaring out in an uncontrolled burst that forced him to yelp and shake out his stinging hand. Ow, okay, that one actually hurt, Naruto muttered, inspecting a faint pink mark on his palm with a wince. You're pushing too much chakra too fast again, Kakashi observed, crouching down to examine the mark with mild concern before determining it wasn't serious enough to warrant stopping. This isn't the tree exercise. You can't brute force your way through fine manipulation with sheer volume. It requires patience you're currently not applying. I'm being patient, Naruto protested, a little too loudly for the quiet night around them. You've made 4 attempts in the last 2 minutes, Kakashi said unbothered. That's not patience. That's rushing with extra steps. Naruto opened his mouth to argue, caught the flat, unimpressed look on his sensei's face, and closed it again with a huff, some of the fight draining out of his frustration in the face of an argument he couldn't really win. Fine. Slower. Got it. He took a breath, deliberately forcing his shoulders to relax, and tried again, genuinely tried, this time, to apply the careful, measured discipline Kakashi had been drilling into him rather than his usual instinct to simply push harder whenever something wasn't working. The flame at his palm flickered, steadied, and slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, extended outward a few inches beyond his fingertips, a thin, wavering tongue of fire hovering in the air above his open hand. Naruto froze, afraid that moving or even breathing too hard might disrupt it. Sensei! Sensei, look! I see it, Kakashi said quietly, genuine approval warming his voice. Hold it. Don't force it further, just maintain what you have. Naruto held his breath, focus narrowed entirely down to the small, wavering flame extended above his palm, watching it flicker and dance in the cool night air for nearly 10 full seconds before his concentration finally slipped and it guttered out. He let out a whoop of triumph that echoed a little too loudly through the quiet clearing, immediately clapping a hand over his own mouth as Kakashi shot him a pointed look. Sorry, Naruto whispered, though the enormous grin on his face didn't shrink at all. Sorry, that was just, did you see that? I actually did it. You did, Kakashi confirmed, allowing himself a small, genuine smile. That's real progress, Naruto. Faster progress than I expected, honestly. At this rate. He didn't get to finish the sentence. Because that was the exact moment everything went sideways. Naruto, still riding the high of his success, decided, against every ounce of the patience he just spent the last 20 minutes cultivating, that he wanted to try it one more time immediately, without pausing to rest or reset the way Kakashi would normally have insisted on. One more, he said, already reaching for that same emotional trigger, chakra surging up through his coils with more enthusiasm than discipline. I've got this now, watch. Naruto, wait. Too late. The flame that erupted from his palm this time wasn't a small, controlled extension. It was a genuine burst, larger, hotter, fueled by the overconfidence of recent success rather than the careful restraint that had produced it in the first place, and it caught not just the air above his hand, but the dry grass at his feet, which had been slowly drying out under weeks of insufficient rain in a country still recovering from years of resource scarcity under Gado's rule. The flame licked outward across a small patch of grass and, before either of them could react, jumped to the low, dry brush at the edge of the clearing. Kakashi-sensei. Naruto's voice cracked with alarm as the fire spread faster than either of them expected, crackling hungrily through dry underbrush that hadn't seen meaningful rainfall in longer than either of them had bothered to think about. Kakashi was already moving, snapping through a series of hand seals with the speed of a man who had, in fact, anticipated exactly this kind of complication happening eventually. Water release, water trumpet! A concentrated blast of water erupted from his mouth, arcing across the spreading flames and dousing them in a hissing, steaming rush that cut the fire off before it could spread beyond a modest, blackened patch at the edge of the clearing. Smoke curled upward into the night air, thick and acrid, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, both staring at the smoldering evidence of just how quickly a small mistake could have become a genuinely serious problem. Okay, Naruto said finally, voice small. Okay, that could have been really bad. That was really bad, Kakashi said, and for once there wasn't much amusement in his tone at all. This is exactly why we're doing this slowly and carefully, Naruto. Fire doesn't respect enthusiasm. It doesn't care how good your last attempt felt. A moment's overconfidence, and you could have set this entire section of forest ablaze. Forest that happens to be a stone's throw from a village full of civilians who have already suffered more than enough under Gado's rule without adding a wildfire to the list. Naruto's face had gone pale, the triumphant grin from a minute ago completely wiped away, replaced by something closer to genuine shame. I didn't think. That's the problem, Kakashi said, not unkindly but firm. With this ability in particular, thinking has to come before acting. Every single time. Do you understand why that matters more here than it does with your usual approach to things? Naruto swallowed hard, staring at the blackened, smoking patch of ground at his feet. Because if I mess up with a clone jutsu or something, worst case I just look dumb. But if I mess up with this, people could genuinely get hurt, Kakashi finished quietly. Property could burn. And it wouldn't just be your mistake to carry. It would put everyone around us at risk, including people who have absolutely no idea this ability exists in the first place. The weight of that landed hard, and Naruto stood there for a long moment in silence, staring at the evidence of his own recklessness, feeling smaller and more sobered than he had in longer than he could remember. I'm sorry, he said finally. I got excited. I wasn't thinking. I know, Kakashi said, some of the sharpness easing out of his tone as he crouched down to examine the extinguished patch of ground more carefully, making sure nothing was still smoldering beneath the surface. "And for what it's worth, I'd rather you make this mistake here, tonight, under my supervision, where I can put it out before real damage happens, than have it happen somewhere I'm not there to catch it. This is exactly why we're doing this carefully, in a controlled setting, rather than letting you experiment freely wherever and whenever the impulse strikes." Naruto nodded slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing at the reassurance, even as the lesson settled uncomfortably deep. "It won't happen again. I mean it." "I believe you," Kakashi said, and in a rare moment of genuine warmth breaking through his usual careful reserve, added, "For what it's worth, the technique itself, the extension you managed before that, was genuinely impressive. Better than I expected from a single night's focused practice. The mistake doesn't erase that progress. It just means we build discipline alongside the skill, rather than skill on its own." That helped, more than Naruto probably would have admitted out loud. He managed a small, sheepish smile, some of the shame in his expression giving way to grudging determination. "So, no more fire stuff tonight?" "No more fire stuff tonight," Kakashi confirmed. "We're done for now. Let's make sure this is fully out, and then we're heading back before." That was, of course, exactly the moment they both heard the twig snap. Both of them went instantly, completely still, every instinct sharpening at once. Kakashi's hand drifted, almost imperceptibly, toward the kunai holster at his hip, single visible eye scanning the tree line with the focused intensity of a man who had just spent the last several minutes assuming they were completely alone, and was now rapidly recalculating that assumption. "Who's there?" he called out, voice level but edged with genuine readiness. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a familiar figure stepped into the moonlight, dark hair, arms crossed, expression somewhere between suspicious and deeply unimpressed. "Sasuke?" Naruto's voice cracked with a mixture of relief and dawning horror as he recognized his teammate. "What are you doing out here?" Sasuke's dark eyes flicked between the two of them, Kakashi's carefully neutral expression, Naruto's guilty, wide-eyed panic, and the unmistakable, still smoking scorched patch of grass and brush at the clearing's edge, with the specific, methodical calculation of someone piecing together a puzzle in real time. "I woke up for water," Sasuke said slowly, "and I noticed both of you were gone. I got curious. Followed the smell of smoke." His gaze settled pointedly on the blackened ground. "Care to explain what exactly the two of you have been doing out here in the middle of the night?" Naruto's mind went completely, catastrophically blank. Every possible excuse he might have offered evaporated in the face of Sasuke's sharp, evaluating stare, and for one horrifying second, Naruto was absolutely certain the entire secret was about to unravel right here, in this clearing, less than 24 hours after Kakashi had specifically, explicitly told him to keep it contained. Kakashi, to his credit, recovered his composure a full second faster than his student did. "Extra training," Kakashi said smoothly, stepping slightly forward, positioning himself with casual deliberateness between Sasuke and the most obviously incriminating patch of scorched ground. "Naruto's chakra reserves are unusually large, even by the standards of most genin. I wanted to run him through some additional exercises to help burn through some of that excess energy more productively, improve his overall control before we resume team training tomorrow." Sasuke's eyes narrowed slightly. "Extra training that involves fire?" "An accident during a chakra exhaustion drill," Kakashi said, without missing a beat, gesturing vaguely at the scorched grass with the easy, unbothered tone of someone discussing a mildly embarrassing but entirely mundane mishap. "Naruto overcorrected on a substitution variant, and ended up channeling considerably more raw chakra into a kunai than intended. Created some friction heat against dry brush. Nothing more mysterious than that, just a clumsy mistake, quickly handled." It was, Naruto had to admit even through his own residual panic, an impressively smooth lie, plausible, specific enough to sound credible without inviting too many follow-up questions, delivered with exactly the right note of mild exasperation a Jonin sensei might genuinely feel about a student's clumsy mistake. Sasuke's gaze lingered on the scene a moment longer, clearly turning the explanation over, weighing it against whatever specific evidence he'd been piecing together on his walk over. Naruto held his breath, willing his own expression into something resembling sheepish embarrassment rather than outright panic, which, given how genuinely mortified he already felt about the whole situation, wasn't actually that difficult to manage. "Fine," Sasuke said finally, though his tone made it clear he wasn't entirely convinced, just apparently unwilling to push the issue further at. Naruto glanced past him toward the sky, nearly 2 in the morning. "Just try not to burn down the whole forest before we actually finish this mission. Some of us would like Zabuza to be the thing that kills us, not our own teammates' incompetence." Hey! Naruto sputtered, indignation momentarily overriding lingering panic. "I'm not that bad. You just set a patch of forest on fire during a training exercise," Sasuke said flatly, already turning to head back toward the house. "I'm going back to sleep. Try to keep the collateral damage to a minimum for the rest of the night, dead last." He disappeared back into the trees without waiting for a response, footsteps fading into the darkness, and it took several long seconds after he'd gone before either Naruto or Kakashi fully let out the breath they'd both apparently been holding. "That," Kakashi said quietly, once he was reasonably confident Sasuke was well out of earshot, "was too close." "Yeah," Naruto agreed, sagging slightly with released tension. "Yeah, no kidding. I thought we were done for. He's way too sharp, sensei. He's gonna figure it out eventually if we keep doing this." "Probably," Kakashi admitted, which wasn't exactly the reassurance Naruto had been hoping for. "Sasuke's observational instincts are genuinely excellent, arguably his single greatest natural asset, even more than his physical talent. We got lucky tonight because the explanation happened to be plausible enough, and because he's tired enough, this late, not to push harder. We won't necessarily get that same luck next time." "So what do we do?" Naruto asked, a knot of fresh anxiety settling in his stomach. "Just stop training?" "No," Kakashi said firmly. "We adjust. Later hours, further from the house. More careful containment of any visible or scent-based evidence. No more open flame on dry ground where the smell can carry, for one thing. And," he fixed Naruto with a pointed, meaningful look, "considerably more discipline from you about not pushing for one more attempt the moment you feel confident. Tonight's fire wasn't caused by lack of skill, Naruto. It was caused by impatience. That's the single biggest risk factor in this entire process, and it's entirely within your control to manage." Naruto winced, the reminder landing exactly as uncomfortably as it was meant to. "Yeah. Okay. I hear you." "I hope you do," Kakashi said, though the edge in his voice had softened somewhat. "Because the stakes only get higher from here. We're going to keep training. But we're going to do it smarter, starting tomorrow night. For now," he glanced up at the moon, gauging the hour, "we've pushed our luck about as far as it's going to stretch tonight. Let's get back before Sakura wakes up too and we have twice the explaining to do." They made their way back through the dark trees in comparative silence, both of them turning the events of the night over in their own way, Kakashi running through contingencies for how to manage Sasuke's suspicion if it resurfaced, Naruto wrestling with a tangled knot of excitement, shame, and lingering adrenaline that made sleep feel like a distant, unlikely prospect despite how exhausted his body actually was. Just before they reached the house, Kakashi paused, glancing back at his student with an expression that was, for once, entirely serious. "For what it's worth," he said, "tonight wasn't a failure. You made genuine progress with the flame extension before the mistake happened. Real, meaningful progress. What matters now is carrying the lesson forward with you, not letting the fear of another mistake make you hesitant, but not letting overconfidence make you careless either. Balance. That's what we're building toward. Naruto nodded slowly, some of the tightness in his chest easing at the reassurance. I'll do better next time. I promise. I know you will, Kakashi said, and there was genuine warmth in it, enough that some of Naruto's lingering shame finally started to loosen its grip. Get some sleep. We've got a bridge to keep protecting starting in a few hours, and I doubt Zabuza is going to give us the courtesy of waiting for you to feel well rested before he tries something. Naruto managed a tired, genuine smile at that, some of his usual spark returning despite the exhaustion. Yeah. Guess I'd better be ready for him too, huh? Guess you'd better, Kakashi agreed, and with that, they slipped back into the quiet house, easing doors shut behind them with practiced care, either of them aware, not yet, not for a few more days at least, just how soon that readiness was going to be tested. Because somewhere out beyond the tree line, in a hideout still thick with the smell of bandages and recovery, Zabuza Momochi's wounds were closing faster than anyone in Tezuna's household had any reason to expect. And when he came back, he wasn't coming back alone, and he wasn't coming back cautious. He was coming back for the bridge. For Tezuna. For a rematch he had absolutely no intention of losing twice. And this time, Naruto Uzumaki wasn't going to be walking into that fight with just wind at his back. What if Naruto secretly had a rare fire release affinity alongside wind? Chapter 4: The Bridge Reforged. Last time, a moment of careless overconfidence turned a quiet training session into a genuine crisis, a burst of uncontrolled fire chakra that very nearly set an entire section of forest ablaze, and came within a single misread explanation of exposing Naruto's secret to the one teammate sharp enough to have pieced it together on the spot. Sasuke walked away from that clearing with lingering suspicion instead of certainty, and Kakashi walked away from it with a hard lesson reinforced. This ability, however remarkable, was still dangerously unrefined, and every session carried real risk. But training in a quiet clearing at 2 in the morning is one thing. What's coming in this chapter is something else entirely. Because Zabuza Momochi doesn't wait forever. And when a man like that finally decides he's healed enough for a rematch, he doesn't walk back onto that bridge alone, cautious, testing the water. He walks back onto it to finish what he started. If you've been with this series from the beginning, you already know this fight. You know about the mist, the mirrors, the moment that breaks Naruto's heart wide open on that bridge. But you don't know what happens when a boy carrying a secret nobody else can see gets pushed past every limit he thought he had, and something buried deep inside him finally, catastrophically, breaks the surface in front of witnesses who were never supposed to see it. Make sure you're subscribed, because this is the chapter this entire series has been building toward. Let's begin. 3 days had passed since the incident in the clearing, and in that time, something had settled into an uneasy but workable rhythm between Naruto and Kakashi. Late-night sessions continued, quieter now, more disciplined, conducted further from the house with meticulous attention to dry ground and carrying scent, exactly the way Kakashi had insisted. Naruto's control had improved measurably in that time, the wild, explosive unpredictability of his first attempts giving way to something steadier, more deliberate. He could summon a controlled flame at will now, sustain it for the better part of a minute, extend it a short distance from his palm with reasonably consistent success. He hadn't dared attempt the strange, unstable fusion of wind and fire again, not after Kakashi's stern warnings about how far beyond his current skill level that particular technique actually sat. But the foundation, however modest, was real. Sasuke's suspicion, for its part, seemed to have quietly faded, or at least gone dormant beneath the more pressing demands of daily training and the looming threat of Zabuza's return. He hadn't brought up the scorched clearing again, hadn't pushed further questions Naruto wasn't ready to answer. Whether that meant he genuinely accepted Kakashi's explanation or simply decided it wasn't worth the energy to keep pursuing was something Naruto tried very hard not to think about too closely. Tree climbing had, by that third day, become something all three genin had functionally mastered, Sasuke and Sakura reaching the crown of the tree with clean, confident control, Naruto trailing only slightly behind them now, his control sharper than it had any business being after just a handful of days, though of course nobody but Kakashi understood exactly why. It was on the morning of the fourth day, as the four of them made their way toward the bridge for another routine day of guard duty, that the peace finally, decisively broke. The mist rolled in without warning, thick, unnatural, swallowing the half-finished bridge in gray obscurity the way it had once before, and every single member of Team 7 went rigid with the same shared recognition at once. "He's back," Kakashi said quietly, single visible eye already scanning the thickening fog with sharp, focused intensity. "Everyone stay close. Protect Tazuna. Do not engage unless there's no other choice." Tazuna, standing on the half-built span of his own bridge, went pale beneath his weathered features. "You're telling me that swordsman survived?" "He's tougher than a single defeat," Kakashi said grimly, drawing a kunai as the mist thickened further, visibility dropping to a few scant feet in every direction. "Stay behind us." A low, familiar chuckle rolled out of the fog, rough, amused, unmistakably Zabuza Momochi's voice, closer than any of them would have liked. "Kakashi," the voice said, dripping with dark satisfaction. "I've been looking forward to this. Did you miss me?" "Can't say I did," Kakashi replied, tension coiled tight beneath his casual tone. "Though I notice you didn't come alone this time." "Wouldn't dream of it," Zabuza said, and from somewhere within the swirling gray, a second figure materialized, smaller, slighter, moving with a fluid, near-silent grace that made every hair on the back of Naruto's neck stand on end even before he got a proper look at the newcomer's face. "Haku." Naruto's stomach twisted at the sight of him, of her, he still wasn't entirely sure which, and the confusion of that uncertainty had bothered him ever since their first strange, quiet meeting in the forest days earlier, when he hadn't known who he was talking to. A kind, gentle stranger who'd spoken about precious people and painful sacrifice, who tended a small basket of medicinal herbs with careful, practiced hands, dressed modestly in simple, high-collared robes that gave away nothing of who or what they truly were. He remembered that conversation now with a fresh, sick lurch of understanding, remembered thinking, at the time, that whoever this stranger was, they carried a weight of loss and purpose that Naruto had recognized, on some instinctive level, as familiar. He hadn't known then that the precious person Haku had spoken about with such quiet devotion was the same man now standing beside him in the mist, blade resting easily across one massive shoulder. "You," Naruto said, voice tight with a confusing tangle of betrayal and something that wasn't quite anger. "You're the one Zabuza's working with?" Haku's expression, visible now beneath the thinning edge of mist, held something apologetic, almost sorrowful. "I told you before. I have someone precious to protect. I meant that." "Enough sentiment," Zabuza growled. "Haku, deal with the brats. I'll handle Kakashi myself, properly this time." "Understood," Haku said quietly, and in the space of a single heartbeat, he'd crossed the distance between them with a speed that none of the genin, not even Sasuke, whose reflexes were the sharpest among them, fully registered until it was already too late to react. What followed happened fast enough that Naruto would spend years afterward trying to piece the exact sequence back together in his memory. Haku's hands moved through a series of seals faster than anything Naruto had ever seen, not the deliberate, careful pace of an academy student working through memorized forms, but the fluid, effortless speed of someone who had rehearsed this exact motion thousands of times until it had become as natural as breathing. "Secret jutsu, demonic ice mirrors," The air around them shifted, moisture in the mist-thick atmosphere suddenly crystallizing, condensing, freezing into a ring of towering, translucent ice panels that rose up out of the ground and arced overhead, forming a dome, a cage, around Sasuke and Naruto both, trapping them together inside a glittering enclosure of mirrored ice while Sakura and Kakashi found themselves shoved outside its perimeter, unable to reach through. Sasuke! Naruto! Sakura's voice, muffled and distant through the ice, carried real panic. Stay back! Kakashi called, already moving toward Zabuza with grim determination, single Sharingan eye tracking the swordsman's every motion. Protect Tazuna. I'll deal with Zabuza. Trust Naruto and Sasuke to handle this. Inside the dome, Naruto's head whipped around, taking in the enclosure with rising alarm. Dozens of identical ice mirrors surrounded them on every side, curving overhead to seal the space entirely, each surface gleaming with an eerie, reflective sheen under whatever pale light filtered through the mist. What is this? Naruto demanded, kunai already drawn, back pressed instinctively against Sasuke's as they oriented themselves against a threat neither of them could quite locate. I don't know, Sasuke said tightly, dark eyes scanning the mirrors with fierce, calculating focus. But I don't like it. Haku's voice drifted from somewhere within the reflections, impossible to pinpoint. I'm sorry it has to be this way. But I won't let anyone stand between me and the mission Zabuza's given me. Please, try not to make this any more painful than it needs to be. And then, before either of them could respond, Haku's form dissolved into one of the mirrors, and reappeared, simultaneously, reflected across every single surface surrounding them, dozens of identical figures moving in perfect, terrifying unison. The first volley of Saban needles came from every direction at once. If you've followed this story before, in any of its versions, you already know how brutal this fight becomes. Haku's speed, augmented by his mastery of the mirrors, made him, her, them, nearly untouchable, a blur of motion striking from every angle simultaneously, needles finding gaps in Sasuke and Naruto's defenses again and again despite their best efforts to anticipate and block. Sasuke, to his credit, adapted faster than Naruto initially could. His Sharingan, awakened weeks earlier under the forest of death's pressure and honed further since, began tracking fragments of Haku's movement with increasing precision, catching motion just a fraction of a second before impact, enough to deflect or dodge a portion of the barrage even as needles found their marks elsewhere across both their bodies. Naruto had no such advantage. He fought on raw instinct and stubborn refusal to stay down, taking hit after hit, blood soaking through his jacket in a dozen small, stinging wounds that accumulated into something genuinely dangerous the longer the assault continued. We need a plan, Sasuke bit out, breathing hard, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. We can't keep taking hits like this. Working on it, Naruto snapped back, wiping blood from his lip, eyes darting frantically across the ring of mirrors surrounding them. Every reflection showed the same calm, apologetic expression, every surface a potential origin point for the next strike, and no matter which direction he faced, he could feel the weight of being watched from everywhere at once. There's gotta be a way to break this, he thought desperately. Some weakness, something. And then, in the chaos of dodging another volley, an idea flickered to life in the back of his mind, reckless, half-formed, born of pure desperation rather than careful planning. The mirrors are ice. Ice melts. He didn't have time to weigh the wisdom of the idea, didn't have time to consider Kakashi's careful, repeated warnings about discipline and control and never using this ability in the heat of the moment without proper restraint. He barely had time to think at all before the next volley forced him into a defensive scramble, and in the split second where his back was pressed against the nearest mirror's surface, cornered with nowhere left to dodge, something in him simply reacted. Heat flared behind his ribs, the same familiar, hot coil he'd learned to recognize over the past several nights of quiet, careful training, and without conscious thought, Without any of the deliberate control Kakashi had spent hours drilling into him, Naruto slammed his open palm backward against the mirror behind him and let that heat pour out through his skin. The ice cracked. Not shattered. The technique was far too strong, far too reinforced by Haku's ongoing chakra, for a single untrained burst to break it completely, but a spiderweb of fractures spread outward from the point of contact, the mirror's smooth, reflective surface fogging and warping around a small, blackened scorch mark where Naruto's palm had touched. For just a fraction of a second, the constant, disorienting barrage of needles paused. Haku's presence within the mirrors went very still. That shouldn't be possible, he thought, tracking the damaged mirror with sharp, careful attention even as he continued moving through the remaining panels. That boy's chakra reads as wind-natured. Wind doesn't crack ice like that, not with heat damage. That's... The realization hit him mid-motion, a half-beat of genuine surprise breaking through his usual calm, focused composure. Fire. That's fire chakra. But his file, everything about the way he fights, the way his chakra signature reads, that doesn't match. It wasn't much of a distraction, a fraction of a second, no more, but Sasuke, sharp-eyed and already primed to seize any opening the fight offered, caught the hesitation and used it, driving forward with a burst of speed that landed a solid strike against one of the mirrors, forcing Haku to abandon the pursuit of that particular thread of curiosity and refocus fully on defense. The fight resumed its brutal pace almost immediately, but something had shifted. Haku's attention, previously distributed with cold, even precision across both targets, now carried an unmistakable undercurrent of focused curiosity whenever it turned toward Naruto specifically, watching, calculating, trying to understand exactly what he just witnessed. Naruto, for his part, was too caught up in the desperate rhythm of survival to fully register what he just revealed. He knew, distantly, that using fire in front of Haku violated every single careful precaution Kakashi had drilled into him over the past several nights. He knew it was reckless, uncontrolled, exactly the kind of impulsive mistake that had already nearly exposed his secret once before in that scorched clearing. But cornered, bleeding, facing an opponent who moved faster than either he or Sasuke could reliably track, that careful discipline had evaporated in the face of raw survival instinct. I'll deal with the consequences later, he thought grimly, wiping fresh blood from a shallow cut along his forearm. Right now I just need to not die. The fight ground on, brutal and relentless, needles finding their marks with increasing frequency as exhaustion began to wear down both Genin's ability to track and evade Haku's overwhelming speed. Sasuke's Sharingan bought him precious fractions of a second, but even that advantage was beginning to fray under the sheer accumulated toll of the engagement, his movements growing marginally slower, his reactions marginally less precise with every passing minute. Naruto reached for fire again, deliberately this time, the initial shock of instinctive reaction giving way to conscious, desperate strategy. If it had worked once, cracking that mirror even slightly, maybe it could work again. Maybe with enough repeated strikes he could actually break through one of these panels and create an opening for escape or counterattack. But his second and third attempts produced far weaker results than the first. A faint warming of his palm, a thin curl of smoke against the ice, nothing close to the crack he'd managed under the pure, unthinking desperation of that first strike. Fear and adrenaline, it turned out, weren't the same reliable trigger as the focused, controlled emotional states he'd learned to summon during training. In the chaos of active combat, exhausted and bleeding and being pelted with needles from every direction, his conscious control kept slipping through his fingers exactly when he needed it most. Come on, he thought desperately, gritting his teeth against another volley of needles biting into his shoulder and thigh. Come on, work, why isn't it working? Naruto! Sasuke's voice cut through his concentration, sharp with warning. Focus! Whatever you're trying to do, it's not working right now. We need to find another way out of this. He was right, and Naruto knew it, forcing himself to abandon the increasingly desperate attempts at fire and refocus on simple, brutal survival alongside his teammate. But the damage, in a sense, had already been done. Haku had seen enough, one genuine crack in the ice, one confirmed flicker of fire chakra from a boy whose file said wind, to know that something unusual, something worth investigating, was hiding beneath the underdog reputation of Konoha's loudest, most dismissed genin. The turning point of the fight, the one that every version of this story eventually arrives at, no matter how many small differences accumulate along the way, came in a single, terrible moment neither Sasuke nor Naruto saw fully coming. Exhausted, bleeding, and increasingly desperate, Naruto made a critical misjudgment, overextending in an attempt to close the distance and land a direct hit against one of the mirrors, leaving himself dangerously exposed in the process. Haku, faster and more precise than either genin could consistently track, seized the opening with lethal intent, a volley of Saban aimed directly at vital points, a strike clearly meant to end the fight decisively rather than simply wound. Naruto barely had time to register the danger before Sasuke moved. It happened faster than thought, a blur of motion, dark hair and the flash of the Sharingan, Sasuke throwing himself bodily into the path of an attack meant for his teammate, absorbing a strike that would otherwise have found Naruto's exposed back. He crumpled. Sasuke! Naruto's voice cracked, raw with a horror that eclipsed every other sensation in his exhausted, battered body, dropping to his knees beside his fallen teammate with hands shaking too hard to be steady. Blood pooled beneath Sasuke's still form, needles embedded across his shoulder and chest, dark eyes closed, breath shallow and uneven. Why? Naruto whispered, voice breaking. Why would you hate me, why would you? Sasuke's eyes cracked open, just barely, a thin, weak, characteristically dry ghost of a smirk tugging at his bloodied lips. Don't get the wrong idea, idiot. My body just moved on its own. And then his eyes closed again, and this time they didn't open. For a long, terrible moment, the entire world seemed to fall away around Naruto Uzumaki. The ice mirrors. Haku's careful, apologetic presence. The distant, muffled sounds of Kakashi's ongoing battle against Zabuza outside the dome. All of it faded into meaningless background noise against the singular, devastating reality kneeling in front of him. Sasuke's dead. Sasuke's dead because of me. Something inside him broke. If you've read or watched this story before, you know what usually happens next. The surge of the Nine-Tails chakra, the red, furious cloak that erupts from Naruto's devastated grief and rage, transforming him briefly into something far more dangerous than any 12-year-old genin has any business being. That happened here too. The familiar, oppressive pressure of chakra swelling up from somewhere deep and ancient inside him, red and hot and furious, whiskered cheeks darkening, eyes bleeding from blue into feral crimson slits. Haku, watching from within the mirrors, felt the abrupt, terrifying shift in the air and went rigid with genuine alarm for the first time since the fight had begun. But this time, in this particular thread of the story, in this version where a rare second chakra nature had been quietly, secretly cultivated over the past several nights, something else happened too, tangled up inextricably with the raging red chakra clawing its way to the surface. Because grief and fury are, in their own devastating way, exactly the kind of emotional extremity that had triggered every single genuine breakthrough Naruto had managed with fire so far. And with the Nine-Tails chakra already surging, already stripping away every ounce of careful, deliberate control he'd normally have exercised, that second buried nature didn't stay quietly contained the way it had throughout the rest of the fight. It erupted. The air around Naruto shimmered, not just with the familiar, oppressive heat haze of the Nine-Tails chakra cloak, but with something else layered underneath it, a strange, distorted quality to the heat that made the very air seem to bend and ripple in ways that had nothing to do with simple demonic chakra. Haku, watching through the mirrors with growing, genuine alarm, felt it before he fully understood what he was seeing. A wave of heat that didn't match any chakra signature he'd ever encountered, wild and raw and entirely uncontrolled, radiating outward from a boy who, moments earlier, had seemed like nothing more than an overwhelmed, exhausted genin fighting well past the edge of his actual ability. Naruto's head snapped up, feral crimson eyes locking onto the nearest mirror with an intensity that made even Haku's carefully cultivated composure falter for a genuine, unmistakable heartbeat. "You!" Naruto snarled, voice distorted, layered with something low and inhuman beneath his own. "Hurt Sasuke!" He moved before Haku could react, faster than should have been possible, faster than the Ninetales chakra alone should have accounted for, closing the distance to the nearest mirror in a blur and slamming both palms against its surface with the full, unrestrained force of grief, rage, and two chakra natures colliding without any of the careful discipline that would normally have shaped and contained them. The mirror didn't just crack this time. It shattered, not from blunt force alone, but from a wave of superheated distortion that fractured the ice from the inside out, steam hissing violently off the fragments as they exploded outward in a shower of glittering, melting shards. Haku barely managed to phase out of the collapsing mirror in time, reappearing several feet away with genuine shock playing across his usually composed features, staring at the destroyed panel and then at Naruto, at the terrifying, red-cloaked figure standing amid a haze of steam and heat shimmer, chest heaving, feral eyes fixed on him with murderous, grief-stricken intent. "That chakra," Haku said, voice quieter than before, genuine uncertainty threading through his usual calm. "That's not just the fox's power. There's something else in you. Fire layered with wind. I felt it earlier, but I didn't understand what I was seeing." Naruto didn't answer with words. He answered by throwing himself forward, wreathed in a chaotic, unstable haze of red chakra and searing heat, driving Haku backward through his own technique with a ferocity that had nothing left of strategy or restraint in it at all, pure, devastated fury given form. What followed was less a fight than a collision. Haku, forced fully onto the defensive for the first time in the entire engagement, phasing between mirrors with increasing desperation as Naruto tore through his defenses with strikes that scorched and shattered ice on contact, the entire dome beginning to fill with drifting steam and the acrid smell of melted, superheated water. Kakashi, still locked in his own brutal engagement against Zabuza several yards away, felt the shift in the air the moment it happened, the unmistakable, oppressive weight of the Ninetales chakra flooding the battlefield, tangled with something else entirely, a familiar signature he recognized immediately with a jolt of genuine alarm that very nearly cost him against Zabuza's blade. "That's not just the fox," Kakashi thought, parrying a heavy strike from Zabuza's massive sword with gritted teeth. "That's Naruto losing control of both at once. This is exactly the situation I was trying to prevent." But there was nothing he could do about it in that moment, trapped in his own desperate fight, unable to break away without leaving Tazuna dangerously exposed, and so all he could do was fight harder, faster, praying that whatever was happening inside that dome of ice resolved itself before it spiraled into something none of them could recover from. Inside the mirrors, Haku fought a losing battle against an opponent who no longer cared about tactics, technique, or self-preservation, only about reaching the source of Sasuke's injury and making it pay. Mirror after mirror cracked and shattered under the combined assault of raw demonic chakra and wild, untrained fire, until finally, cornered against the last remaining intact panel, Haku made a decision that would ultimately define the rest of the fight. He dropped the mirror technique entirely, materializing fully in the open, Saban raised in a defensive stance, breathing hard, mask cracked from a glancing hit. "Stop," he said, voice raw with something that wasn't quite fear but sat close beside it. "Please! I don't want to keep fighting you like this." Naruto didn't stop. He drove forward with a snarl, and it was only Haku's desperate, last-second gambit, throwing himself directly into the path of the attack, sacrificing his own defenses entirely to absorb a blow that would otherwise have proven fatal, that finally brought the collision to its devastating conclusion. Zabuza's reaction to watching Haku take that hit, from across the battlefield, was immediate and total. Haku! The raw, anguished fury in his voice cut through everything else happening on that bridge, through Kakashi's careful, calculated combat, through the ringing chaos of shattered eyes still settling across the ground, through the low, retreating growl of chakra finally beginning to recede from Naruto's small, exhausted frame as grief and rage burned themselves out, leaving him swaying, disoriented, staring down at what he'd done with dawning, horrified clarity. What followed, if you know this story, unfolded with brutal, tragic inevitability. Zabuza, driven past every remaining shred of restraint by the sight of his most precious person lying wounded and unmoving, abandoned strategy entirely and threw himself at Kakashi with a desperation that bordered on suicidal, the fight tipping decisively in Kakashi's favor as raw grief overwhelmed Zabuza's usual cold, calculating skill. And into the middle of that chaos, the swirling mist finally thinning, the bridge littered with the wreckage of two brutal, parallel battles, walked Gato. Flanked by a small army of hired thugs, the diminutive businessman surveyed the scene with open, contemptuous satisfaction, revealing, in a few short, cruel sentences, exactly what everyone should have suspected all along, that he had never intended to pay Zabuza for services rendered, that missing nin were, to him, simply expendable tools to be discarded once their usefulness expired, and that he'd brought his own private army specifically to ensure that whatever was left standing after this fight, shinobi and civilians alike, could be conveniently eliminated and the whole affair buried without complication. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of naked, cowardly betrayal that turned even a broken, grieving Zabuza's fury toward a new, more immediate target. Naruto, still reeling from the aftermath of what he'd just done, found his attention snapping back into sharp, present focus as Gato's small army of thugs began advancing across the bridge, weapons raised, clearly intending to finish off whatever remained of the fight's exhausted survivors. He looked down at Sasuke's still form beside him, breathing shallowly, alive, thank every star in the sky, alive but badly hurt, and something cold and determined settled over the ragged remains of his earlier fury. "I'm not letting anyone else get hurt," he said quietly, forcing himself upright despite the deep, aching exhaustion in every muscle, despite the dozens of shallow wounds still stinging across his arms and shoulders. "Not today!" He didn't reach for fire again, not deliberately, not with any conscious strategy behind it. He was simply too exhausted, too thoroughly spent from the earlier eruption of chakra to summon anything close to that level of raw power again. But something had shifted in him during that brief, devastating collision with Haku, some threshold crossed that he wouldn't fully understand the significance of until much later, a confirmation, deep in his bones, that this ability, however dangerous, however uncontrolled, was genuinely, unmistakably his, and that he could reach for it again when it truly mattered. For now, though, it was ordinary courage and stubborn refusal to fall that carried him forward, standing protectively over Sasuke's fallen form as Gato's thugs advanced, kunai raised despite exhaustion, prepared to fight to the last breath if that was what protecting his teammate required. He wasn't alone in that determination for long. Sakura reached them first, having broken away from her position near Tazuna the moment the mirrors shattered and the fighting shifted, dropping to her knees beside Sasuke with a strangled, relieved sob at finding him breathing, already working to assess and stabilize his wounds with whatever basic field medical knowledge she'd absorbed. And then, in one of the story's most memorable turns, the tide shifted decisively in an entirely different way. Inari arrived. Leading a ragtag but determined group of wave villagers, armed with whatever tools and improvised weapons they'd managed to gather, faces set with the particular, hard-won courage of people who had finally, collectively, decided they were done being afraid, Inori burst onto the bridge at the head of a force that, moments earlier, none of Gato's thugs would have believed possible from a country they'd spent years systematically terrorizing into submission. "You don't get to hurt my family anymore!" Inori shouted, voice cracking with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, standing at the front of a crowd that had finally, decisively, chosen to fight back rather than accept another year of Gato's tyranny. The sheer, unexpected sight of the entire village rising up in open defiance broke whatever remained of the thugs' confidence, several of them faltering, glancing uncertainly at each other, clearly having signed on for easy intimidation rather than a genuine, organized fight against people with nothing left to lose. Gato himself, watching his hired muscle waver, began backing away with the particular, undignified panic of a man who had spent his entire career letting others do his fighting for him, and who suddenly found himself very much alone and very much exposed. It was Zabuza, bleeding, exhausted, having just watched Haku fall protecting him, who finally closed that particular chapter of the story, turning his rage toward the man who'd betrayed him with lethal, unstoppable intent, cutting through Gato's remaining bodyguards with brutal efficiency before the businessman himself met an end that, while brief and largely off-screen from the genin's perspective, closed the door decisively on the threat that had haunted the land of waves for years. The aftermath, once the dust and mist finally settled, carried the particular, exhausted weight that follows every genuinely desperate battle. Zabuza, mortally wounded from his own confrontation with Gato's men, spent his final moments in quiet, grief-stricken reflection beside Haku's still form, a conversation between the two of them that none of Team 7 fully overheard, but that left even Naruto, still processing the raw aftermath of his own uncontrolled outburst, with a lump in his throat he couldn't quite explain. Kakashi, exhausted from his own brutal engagement but functional, made his way over to check on his students the moment the immediate threat had cleared, relief plain across his features at finding Sasuke alive, Sakura tending his wounds with steady, focused competence, and Naruto standing protectively over both of them despite clear exhaustion written across every line of his small frame. His relief, however, lasted only until his gaze settled on the wreckage of shattered, half-melted ice mirrors scattered across the bridge, still faintly steaming in the cool morning air, and the unmistakable, telltale scorch marks scattered among the debris. His single visible eye met Naruto's, and something passed between them in that shared glance, an understanding, unspoken but absolutely clear, that this conversation was far from over. "We'll talk," Kakashi said quietly, low enough that Sakura, still focused on Sasuke's wounds, didn't fully catch it. "Later. When we're somewhere private." Naruto swallowed hard, nodding, the full weight of what he'd done, and who might have seen it, settling over him with fresh, sobering clarity. Haku saw it, he thought, glancing toward where Zabuza knelt beside his fallen partner, grief etched across his scarred features. He said something, right in the middle of the fight, about fire and wind together. If he survives this. But that particular worry, at least, resolved itself with grim finality a short while later, when it became clear that neither Zabuza nor Haku had survived their final confrontation with Gato's forces, a tragic, bittersweet end to two lives shaped by circumstances far beyond either of their control, mourned in their own complicated way by a Team 7 that had, in the span of a single devastating fight, come to understand them as something more than simple enemies. The bridge, once finished, would eventually take Tazuna's own suggested name, a tribute, in its own quiet way, to the boy whose stubborn, unshakable belief in heroes had helped inspire an entire village to finally stand up for itself. But that was still weeks away, a story for another time. For now, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, there was only exhaustion, grief, quiet relief, and, for Naruto Uzumaki specifically, a mounting, anxious awareness that the secret he'd worked so hard to keep contained over the past several days had just been witnessed, however briefly, by more people than he'd ever intended. Sasuke, still weak from his injuries but conscious now, propped up against Sakura's careful support, caught Naruto's eye across the wreckage of the bridge with an expression that mixed genuine, grudging gratitude with something sharper underneath it. The particular, evaluating look of someone who had, even semi-conscious and bleeding, registered more of that final confrontation than Naruto would have liked. "That chakra," Sasuke said quietly, voice still weak but unmistakably focused. "Right before I passed out. That wasn't just the fox's power, was it?" Naruto's stomach dropped. Kakashi, standing close enough to overhear, stepped smoothly into the conversation before Naruto could formulate any kind of response. "You lost a significant amount of blood, Sasuke. I wouldn't put too much weight on exactly what you did or didn't perceive in that state. Let's focus on getting you back to Tazuna's house and properly treated before we worry about anything else." It was, Naruto thought, watching his sensei carefully redirect the conversation, another smooth deflection, but one that carried a weight of genuine urgency underneath the practiced ease of its delivery. This was the second time in less than a week that Kakashi had been forced to think fast to protect a secret that seemed to grow more difficult to contain with every single day that passed. Sasuke's dark eyes lingered on Naruto for a long moment, clearly unconvinced but too exhausted, in the end, to push the issue further. He let it go, for now, settling back against Sakura's support with a small, tired grunt of acknowledgement. But Naruto knew, watching that particular, sharp-eyed suspicion settle into something more patient and calculating rather than fully dismissed, that this conversation was far from truly over. That night, back at Tazuna's house, once Sasuke had been properly treated and settled to rest, once the household had finally quieted into the particular, exhausted hush that follows a day of genuine crisis successfully survived, Kakashi found Naruto sitting alone on the back porch, staring out at the darkened tree line with an expression far more subdued than his usual restless energy. "You saved Sasuke's life today," Kakashi said quietly, settling down beside him. "Whatever else happened out there, that's worth remembering." "I lost control," Naruto said, voice tight. "Completely. I don't even really remember most of what I did after I thought he was dead. Haku said something, right before everything got worse. About fire and wind together. He knew, sensei. And now Sasuke's asking questions too, and I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending this isn't happening." Kakashi was quiet for a long moment, considering his next words with the same careful deliberation he'd brought to every conversation about this particular secret since the moment it first surfaced. "You're right," he said finally. "This is getting harder to contain. Today proved that clearly enough. But Naruto, I need you to understand something important. What happened today wasn't a failure of your training. It was an entirely unprecedented situation, layered on top of a chakra source that would overwhelm control in any shinobi, let alone one still this early into developing an entirely new ability. You didn't fail today. You survived an impossible fight, and you protected your teammate in the process." "But people saw," Naruto said. "Haku saw. Sasuke suspects? How long until it's not just them?" Kakashi looked out at the dark tree line for a long moment before answering, his expression carrying a weight of genuine consideration Naruto hadn't seen from him before. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I know this. Hiding it perfectly forever was never realistic, not once you truly began using it. What matters now is making sure that when it does eventually come to light more broadly, you're ready for it. Strong enough, controlled enough, that it becomes an asset people respect rather than a vulnerability people exploit. That's what the rest of this training is for." Naruto sat with that for a long moment, staring out at the same dark trees where, only a few nights earlier, he'd first learned to hold a flame steady in his open palm. "Okay," he said finally, quiet determination settling back into his voice despite the exhaustion of the day. "Then let's keep training. However long it takes." Kakashi allowed himself a small, genuine smile at that, some of the day's heavy tension finally easing from his shoulders. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Neither of them could have known, sitting together on that quiet porch under a sky finally clear of mist for the first time in days, just how much further this particular secret still had to travel before it found its way fully into the light, or how many more people, in how many more unexpected moments, were about to catch fragments of the truth long before either of them felt ready to reveal it. The bridge was finished. Gato was gone. The land of waves, for the first time in years, could finally begin to breathe. But for Naruto Uzumaki, this was only the beginning of a much longer road, one that was about to lead him straight back to Konoha, straight into a Chunin exam that would test every ounce of the careful control he still hadn't fully mastered, in front of far more dangerous eyes than a single grieving ice user ever could have posed. What if Naruto secretly had a rare fire release affinity alongside wind? Chapter 5, Back to Konoha, Buried Deeper. Last time, on that half-finished bridge in the land of waves, everything Naruto had spent days trying to keep hidden finally cracked open under the worst possible circumstances. Grief and fury tore through his careful control the moment he thought Sasuke was dead, and what came out wasn't just the Nine-Tails' familiar, oppressive chakra. It was something layered underneath it, wild, uncontrolled fire, fused with wind in a way that shattered Haku's ice mirrors and left even Kakashi staring at the wreckage with a sinking, unmistakable sense that this secret had just outgrown the quiet, careful containment he'd built around it. Haku saw it before the end. Sasuke felt it, even half-conscious and bleeding, enough to ask pointed questions the moment he woke up. And now, with the bridge finished, Gato gone, and the land of waves finally free to breathe for the first time in years, Team 7 is heading home. Except home, for Naruto Uzumaki, has never exactly been simple. And this time, he's carrying something back to Konoha that the wrong people would very much like to know about. If you're new to this series, this is the exact moment everything starts getting complicated. Welcome, and make sure you hit subscribe, because this arc is about to walk straight into the heart of the village that's spent Naruto's entire life underestimating him. Let's get into it. The road back to Konoha stretched long and quiet under an early autumn sky, the kind of gentle, golden light that made the whole journey feel almost peaceful after the brutal chaos of the past several days. Sasuke walked with careful, deliberate steps, still favoring his injured shoulder despite Sakura's repeated, increasingly exasperated reminders that he was supposed to be resting it, not testing its limits with every stride. Sakura herself walked close beside him, equal parts genuine concern and stubborn insistence on monitoring his recovery, a role she'd clearly settled into with the same focus she brought to everything else. Naruto walked a few paces behind them, hands laced behind his head in a posture of studied, deliberate casualness that fooled absolutely nobody who bothered to look closely, least of all Kakashi, who kept catching glimpses of the tight, worried set of his youngest student's jaw whenever Naruto thought no one was watching. It had been 3 days since the bridge. 3 days since Haku's final, quiet words about fire and wind tangled together inside him. 3 days since Sasuke had asked, half-conscious and bleeding, whether that chakra had really been just the fox's power. Sasuke hadn't brought it up again since that first question, not directly, anyway, but Naruto had caught him watching more than once during the journey home, dark eyes narrowed in that particular, calculating way that meant a puzzle was still turning over somewhere behind them, unresolved and unforgotten. He's not gonna let this go, Naruto thought, kicking a stray pebble off the dirt road with more force than the action strictly required. Not forever. I know Sasuke. Once he decides something's worth figuring out, he doesn't stop until he's got the answer. It was, he reflected sourly, one of the more annoying things about his rival, the same relentless, focused determination that made Sasuke genuinely dangerous in a fight also made him nearly impossible to successfully deceive for long. Kakashi, walking a short distance ahead with his ever-present orange book held loosely in one hand, seemed outwardly unconcerned, reading, or at least appearing to read, with his usual lazy detachment. But Naruto had learned, over the past several days, to recognize the subtle signs of his sensei's genuine focus hiding beneath that casual exterior, and the slight, almost imperceptible tension in Kakashi's shoulders told him exactly how much of that laziness was performance rather than reality. They walked the rest of the morning in relative quiet, the events of the bridge still settling over all of them in different ways, grief for Zabuza and Haku, tangled and complicated in a way none of them had words for yet, relief at having survived a fight that had, by any reasonable measure, been far beyond what 3 genin should have been asked to face, and for one member of the team specifically, a low, persistent hum of anxiety about exactly how much longer a secret could survive this many witnesses before it finally, inevitably, broke into the open. They reached Konoha's main gate a little past midday, the familiar sight of the village walls rising up ahead of them drawing a small, genuine smile out of even Sasuke's guarded expression. There was something undeniably good about coming home, whatever else waited for them once they arrived, a sense of solid ground beneath their feet after a mission that had asked far more of them than any of them, Kakashi included, had originally anticipated. The gate guards waved them through with the easy familiarity of shinobi who recognized returning teammates, and Team 7 made their way into the village proper, the noise and bustle of Konoha's streets closing back around them like a comfortable, well-worn blanket. "Report to the Hokage's office," Kakashi said, once they'd walked far enough into the village that the immediate press of the crowd had thinned somewhat. "Standard debrief. I'll handle most of it, but Lord Third may have questions for each of you directly, given how far this mission ended up straying from its original C-rank classification." "You think he's gonna be mad we turned a simple bridge guarding job into an A-rank nightmare?" Naruto asked, some of his usual energy returning now that they were back on familiar ground. "I think Lord Third has seen enough missions go sideways over his career that he won't be surprised," Kakashi said dryly. "Concerned, certainly. Mad, less so. Missions rarely stay within their original parameters once someone like Zabuza Momochi gets involved." They made their way through the village toward the Hokage's tower, and if you've been following Naruto's story from the beginning, you already know this walk carries its own quiet, familiar rhythm. The villagers who smiled warmly at Sasuke and Sakura while their expressions cooled and shuddered the moment their eyes landed on Naruto, the particular, practiced way he'd learned to shrug off that difference over years of exposure to it, even when it still stung more than he ever let on. Today, though, walking home from a mission that had genuinely, meaningfully tested and changed him, that familiar sting carried a slightly different weight. Not because the villagers' reactions had changed, they hadn't, not remotely, but because Naruto himself had, in ways none of them could see yet, and the gap between what he now knew he was capable of and what the village still assumed about him had never felt wider. "They don't know," he thought, glancing sideways at an older shopkeeper who deliberately turned away as they passed. "They don't know what I did on that bridge. What I can do now. Maybe someday they will. But not yet." The debrief with Hiruzen Sarutobi proceeded largely as Kakashi had predicted, a careful, methodical accounting of everything that had transpired in the Land of Waves, from the initial ambush by the Demon Brothers through the confirmation of Zabuza's identity, the extended standoff, the eventual battle on the bridge, and the deaths of both Zabuza and Haku in their final confrontation with Gato's forces. Hiruzen listened to all of it with the particular, weathered patience of a man who had heard 1,000 mission reports over a career spanning decades, occasionally asking pointed clarifying questions, his expression growing progressively more grave as the scope of what his youngest and least experienced team had actually faced became clear. "An A-rank confrontation," he said finally, once Kakashi had finished the bulk of his report. "Against a missing nin from the 7 Swordsmen of the Mist, for a team of first-year genin. That's a significant deviation from the original mission parameters, Kakashi." "It was," Kakashi agreed evenly. "I take full responsibility for the decision to continue the mission once its true scope became apparent. In hindsight, I believe it was the correct call, Retreating at that stage would likely have left Tazuna and his family exposed to further attempts on his life, with no guarantee a subsequent team would arrive in time to help. But I understand if that judgment call warrants review. Hiruzen studied him for a long moment, pipe held loosely between weathered fingers, before his expression softened slightly. I won't second-guess a call made in the field, Kakashi, not when the outcome, however costly, ultimately succeeded in its objective. But I do want a full accounting of the injuries sustained. Sasuke, I understand you took a significant hit protecting your teammate? Sasuke, standing a little straighter despite the lingering ache in his shoulder, nodded once. I'm recovering well, Lord Third. It looked worse than it ultimately was. Good, Hiruzen said, something warm flickering briefly across his aged features. That kind of instinct, protecting a teammate without hesitation, speaks well of the bonds this team has built, even this early in your careers together. His gaze shifted then, settling on Naruto with a particular, searching quality that made Naruto's stomach tighten with fresh unease. And you, Naruto, Hiruzen said, tone carefully neutral. Kakashi's report mentions some unusual chakra activity during the final confrontation on the bridge. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate? The room went very still. Naruto's eyes flicked, involuntarily, toward Kakashi, a fraction of a second too obvious to be entirely subtle, though he caught himself quickly, forcing his attention back to the Hokage's weathered, patient face. It was the fox's chakra, Naruto said carefully, the practiced explanation he and Kakashi had discussed on the walk back settling into place. When I thought Sasuke was dead, I kind of lost it. I don't remember a whole lot of what happened after that, honestly. Just that I was really, really angry, and then it was over. It wasn't a lie, exactly. The Nine-Tails chakra had genuinely surged during that confrontation, and Naruto's memory of the specifics really had blurred under the weight of grief and fury. It simply left out one rather significant detail about exactly what else had erupted alongside it. Hiruzen's gaze lingered on him a moment longer than felt entirely comfortable, weathered eyes carrying the particular, careful weight of a man who had spent decades learning to read the subtle gaps between what people said and what they left unsaid. I see, he said finally, and something in his tone suggested he might not be entirely satisfied with the answer, even if he chose, for now, not to push further. Well, that kind of surge is understandable, given the circumstances, and not entirely unprecedented given what we know of your particular situation. I trust it resolved without lasting complication? Yeah, Naruto said, relief flooding through him at the apparent, if incomplete, acceptance of his explanation. No complications. I'm fine. Good, Hiruzen said, and turned his attention back to Sakura for a few final, routine questions about her own experience of the mission, the conversation moving on in a way that let Naruto's shoulders finally, gradually unclench. But Kakashi, watching from the side of the room, caught something in Hiruzen's expression during that brief exchange, a flicker of thoughtful, careful attention that suggested the Hokage's curiosity hadn't been fully satisfied by Naruto's deliberately vague explanation, whatever he'd chosen to let pass unchallenged in the moment. He suspects something, Kakashi thought. Of course he does. Lord Third's been reading underneath the surface of reports for longer than any of us have been alive. The debrief concluded shortly after, Team 7 dismissed with instructions to rest and recover before resuming regular training and mission assignments the following week. Sasuke and Sakura filed out first, already deep in a quiet, familiar argument about whether Sasuke's shoulder actually needed the additional week of light duty Sakura was insisting on. Naruto lingered a step behind, and found Kakashi's hand settling briefly on his shoulder as they exited the Hokage's tower together. Lord Third wants to speak with me privately, Kakashi said quietly, once they were out of earshot of the departing genin. About the mission. I suspect it's exactly the conversation you're worried it might be. Naruto's stomach dropped. You're gonna tell him? About the fire? I have to, Kakashi said, not unkindly but firm. Naruto, listen to me. Lord Third already suspects something beyond a simple chakra surge happened on that bridge. You saw that yourself, just now. If I don't give him an honest, controlled account of what we've discovered, on our own terms, in a private conversation where we can shape how the information is received, he's going to piece it together anyway, eventually, from a much less favorable angle. Possibly through channels either of us would choose. Channels like what? Naruto asked, unease sharpening into something closer to real alarm. Kakashi hesitated, weighing how much to say. Danzo has ears throughout this village, Naruto. Rude operatives, informants, people who report back information the council finds useful regardless of how they acquire it. If word of what happened on that bridge reaches him before it reaches Lord Third through a controlled, deliberate channel, the outcome could be considerably worse than a difficult conversation with the Hokage. The name settled over Naruto with unfamiliar weight. He'd heard Danzo mentioned before, in passing, always accompanied by a particular wariness in whichever adult happened to be speaking, but he never fully understood exactly why the name carried that specific, careful caution. Who is that exactly? He asked. Someone we'll discuss another time, Kakashi said, a shade too quickly for Naruto's comfort, though he chose not to press the issue further given everything else already weighing on his mind. For now, trust that telling Lord Third directly, carefully, on our own terms, is the safer path forward. He's protected your secrets before, Naruto. He'll protect this one too, if we handle it correctly. Naruto swallowed hard, some of his anxiety easing at the reminder, even if it didn't fully dissolve. Okay. I trust you, Sensei. Just be careful how you explain it, alright? I don't want this turning into some big thing. I'll be careful, Kakashi promised, and with that, turned back toward the Hokage's tower, leaving Naruto standing alone in the afternoon sun, watching him go with a knot of uncertainty settling deep in his chest. The conversation between Kakashi and Hiruzen that followed, conducted in the privacy of the Hokage's office with the door firmly closed and a chakra-suppressing privacy seal activated around the room's perimeter, unfolded with far more gravity than Kakashi's earlier, careful public deflection had suggested. I want the complete account, Hiruzen said, once Kakashi had confirmed the room was secure. Everything you left out of the official debrief, Kakashi. I could see it in the boy's face, and in yours, if I'm honest, that there's considerably more to this story than a simple surge of the fox's chakra. Kakashi took a breath, and told him everything, the tree-climbing exercise gone strange, the confirmed second affinity, the careful nighttime training sessions, the near-miss with Sasuke discovering them, the eventual, uncontrolled eruption on the bridge that had fused with the Nine-Tails chakra into something neither of them fully understood yet. Hiruzen listened without interrupting, his expression growing steadily more thoughtful, occasionally tapping the ash from his pipe with slow, deliberate motions that suggested a mind working carefully through implications far beyond the immediate facts of the report. A genuine dual affinity, he said finally, once Kakashi had finished. Wind and fire both, manifesting with functional usability even before any structured training began. That is, exceptionally rare, Kakashi. Rare enough that I can count on one hand the number of documented cases across recorded shinobi history. I'm aware, Kakashi said. Which is precisely why I chose to keep it contained rather than reporting it through standard channels immediately. I wanted to understand the shape of what we were dealing with before it became a matter of village record, and frankly, I was concerned about exactly the kind of attention it might draw, given Naruto's existing circumstances. Hiruzen's weathered features tightened slightly at that, understanding passing between the two of them without either needing to speak the specific concern aloud. Both men understood, with the particular clarity of people who had spent years quietly protecting a boy either of them could fully protect, exactly what kind of danger a second remarkable trait posed layered on top of the first, most dangerous secret Naruto already carried. You were right to be cautious, Hiruzen said finally. Though I confess some concern about the boy conducting this kind of experimental training without proper oversight, given how easily uncontrolled fire chakra can become genuinely destructive. The training's been careful, Kakashi said. Deliberate, structured, conducted well away from anything flammable or populated. The incident on the bridge was an aberration. Extreme emotional distress combined with the Nine-Tails chakra surge, circumstances well beyond what controlled training sessions could reasonably prepare for. Hiruzen was quiet for a long moment, weighing the situation with the careful gravity of a man accustomed to balancing competing concerns. A young shinobi's well-being and growth against the political realities of a village that had never quite learned to separate the two where Naruto Uzumaki specifically was concerned. Here is what we'll do, he said finally. This information stays contained, precisely as you've been managing it. No formal record beyond what's already necessarily documented in your original mission report. The chakra surge attributed to emotional distress and the fox's influence, nothing more specific. Continue training under your direct supervision, with regular updates to me personally rather than through any standard channel that might reach less trustworthy ears. Understood, Kakashi said. And Kakashi, Hiruzen's expression softened slightly, weathered eyes carrying real warmth beneath the careful gravity of the conversation. Thank you for handling this with the same care you clearly handled everything else on that mission. Naruto is fortunate to have a sensei willing to protect him this thoroughly. He's earned that consideration, Kakashi said simply. Many times over, honestly. That night, back at his small apartment for the first time in over a week, Naruto found himself unable to settle into anything resembling normal rest despite the genuine, bone-deep exhaustion of the past several days' travel and lingering injury. He paced the small space restlessly, thoughts tangled between relief at finally being home and anxious uncertainty about exactly how the conversation between Kakashi and Lord Third had gone. A soft knock at his door, well past the hour most visitors would reasonably arrive, drew him up short. He opened it to find Kakashi standing in the hallway, still wearing his mission gear, expression carrying the particular, warm quality of someone who'd spent the past several hours in a genuinely difficult conversation. Can I come in? Kakashi asked. Naruto stepped back to let him through, heart already climbing into his throat. How'd it go? Is he mad? Is he gonna? He's not mad, Kakashi said, settling onto the single worn chair in Naruto's small living space while Naruto perched anxiously on the edge of his own bed. If anything, he was more concerned about your well-being than anything else. We've agreed on a path forward. He explained the arrangement carefully, the continued secrecy, the direct reporting to Hiruzen rather than any wider channel, the careful, structured training that would continue under Kakashi's supervision. Naruto listened with a mixture of relief and lingering unease, some of the tightness in his chest easing as the details settled into place. So he's really okay with all this? Naruto asked, once Kakashi had finished. Not gonna make me stop, or report it to the council, or anything like that. He understands the value of what you're developing, Kakashi said. And he understands the risk of certain people learning about it prematurely, just as clearly as I do. This isn't about hiding shame, Naruto. It never has been. It's about protecting your right to grow into this ability without interference, until you're ready to reveal it entirely on your own terms. Naruto nodded slowly, some genuine warmth breaking through his lingering anxiety at the reassurance. Okay. Yeah. I get it. There is one more thing, Kakashi said, tone shifting slightly, carrying a note of genuine curiosity beneath its careful weight. Lord Third mentioned something I hadn't previously considered, a possible explanation for where this ability might have originated. Given the limited records available about your family history, he couldn't confirm anything definitively. But he did mention that certain lineages, under very specific, rare circumstances, have historically carried latent secondary affinities that skip generations before resurfacing unexpectedly. Naruto's breath caught slightly. Did he say anything about who? Like, whose lineage? Kakashi hesitated, clearly weighing exactly how much to share, before shaking his head slightly. Not specifically. It's still speculation at this point, Naruto, nothing confirmed. I don't want to hand you a theory that turns out to be wrong and have it sit poorly with you. When there's something concrete to share about your family history, I promise you'll be the first to know. For now, focus on what you can control, the training, the discipline, the steady progress you've already made. It wasn't the answer Naruto had been hoping for, and something in his expression, a flicker of old, familiar disappointment quickly, practically buried beneath years of learning not to hope too hard, didn't escape Kakashi's notice. I know it's not satisfying, Kakashi said more gently. I know how much you want answers about where you come from. I promise you, Naruto, that door isn't closed forever. It's just not the right time yet. Yeah, Naruto said, forcing a small, tired smile. I'm used to waiting. Guess I can wait a little longer. Something in that quiet, resigned acceptance struck Kakashi harder than he expected, a fresh reminder of exactly how much this loud, stubborn, endlessly resilient boy had already learned to carry without complaint. For what it's worth, Kakashi said, standing to leave, the wait won't be forever. I promise you that much. Over the following week, life in Konoha settled into a rhythm that felt, on the surface, almost ordinary. Team 7 resumed light training as Sasuke's shoulder finished healing, the three of them running through familiar drills and exercises under Kakashi's watchful supervision, the specific tension of the wave mission gradually easing into the comfortable, familiar background hum of everyday genin life. Beneath that ordinary surface, though, Naruto's private training continued, now conducted with slightly more structure than the rushed, improvised sessions in the Land of Waves had allowed, though still carefully hidden from anyone beyond Kakashi and, by careful extension, the watchful, protective awareness of the Hokage himself. They'd shifted the sessions to Naruto's own training ground now that they were back in Konoha proper, a modest, out-of-the-way clearing he'd claimed as his own years earlier, isolated enough from regular foot traffic that late-night or early-morning sessions rarely risked discovery, the ground itself already scarred and pockmarked from years of Naruto's solo training, providing convenient cover for any fresh, unusual damage that might otherwise draw unwanted attention. Kakashi's schedule, stretched thin by additional duties beyond Team 7's regular training, meant these sessions grew somewhat less frequent than the nightly rhythm they'd established in Wave, 2 or 3 sessions a week now, rather than every single night. But Naruto, to his own genuine surprise, found himself using the intervening time productively rather than simply waiting impatiently for the next scheduled lesson. He began practicing alone. It started almost accidentally, one quiet evening when restless energy and a lingering itch of curiosity about his own progress drove him back out to his training ground on a night Kakashi hadn't scheduled a session. He told himself, initially, that he was just going to check, just confirm he could still summon a small, controlled flame without his sensei standing over him, just make sure the skill hadn't atrophied in the handful of days since their last session. The flame came easily, steadier now than it had been even during their final sessions in Wave, a genuine, if modest, sign of real, accumulated progress. Naruto sat with that small satisfaction for a long moment, watching the flame flicker and dance above his open palm in the quiet darkness of his solitary training ground, something warm and genuinely proud settling in his chest. I did this, he thought. Nobody helping me right now. Just me. He extended it, carefully, the way Kakashi had taught him, a thin, controlled tongue of fire reaching a few inches beyond his fingertips, held steady for several long seconds before he deliberately, carefully let it fade. Emboldened by that small success, he tried something he hadn't yet attempted without Kakashi's direct supervision, reaching, cautiously, for that strange, layered sensation of both natures at once, the wind and fire fusion that had first flickered to unstable life back in that clearing and wave, and had erupted again, wild and uncontrolled, on the bridge against Haku. He approached it carefully this time, none of the desperate, grief-fueled abandon of that bridge fight, none of the reckless overconfidence that had set the forest smoldering during his second night of training. Just slow, deliberate curiosity, easing toward the sensation the way Kakashi had spent so many hours teaching him to approach everything else. A faint shimmer of distorted heat gathered at his palm, smaller, weaker than the chaotic burst that had shattered Haku's mirrors, but genuinely, deliberately summoned rather than torn free by uncontrolled emotion. Naruto held his breath, watching the strange, wavering distortion hover above his open hand, resisting every urge to push harder, to force more power into it the way his instincts always screamed at him to do. It held for nearly 3 full seconds before finally, harmlessly dissipating. Naruto stared at his own hand, heart hammering with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. I did that. On purpose. Without Sensei even here. It wasn't much, a tiny, controlled fraction of the raw, devastating power he'd unleashed against Haku's mirrors, nowhere close to a genuine, usable technique. But it was real, deliberate progress, achieved through his own patient, careful effort rather than the desperate extremity of a life-or-death battle. For a boy who'd spent his entire life being told, implicitly and explicitly, that he lacked the discipline and focus to achieve anything through careful, patient effort, that small, quiet victory meant more than almost anyone around him could have fully appreciated. He kept at it for the better part of an hour, gradually, cautiously extending the duration of that fragile, layered fusion, never pushing hard enough to risk losing control, always erring toward caution and restraint over ambition, exactly the discipline Kakashi had spent so many sessions carefully instilling in him. By the time he finally made his way home, well past midnight, exhausted but genuinely satisfied, Naruto found himself smiling in a way that had nothing to do with pride in front of an audience, and everything to do with the quiet, private satisfaction of having grown, just a little, entirely on his own. He reported his progress to Kakashi at their next scheduled session a few days later, watching his sensei's expression shift from mild surprise into something closer to genuine, impressed approval as Naruto described, and then demonstrated the small, controlled fusion he'd managed to achieve independently. You practice this alone, Kakashi said, watching the faint, careful shimmer of heat distortion gather and hold above Naruto's palm for a solid 4 seconds before dissipating cleanly, without incident. Without supervision, and without losing control. I was careful, Naruto said, a note of genuine pride creeping into his voice. Just like you kept telling me. Slow, deliberate, no pushing past what I could actually handle. Figured if I could keep it together during that fight against Haku, even out of control, I could probably manage it fine if I actually tried to be disciplined about it. Kakashi studied him for a long moment, something warm and genuinely proud settling behind his single visible eye. This is exactly the kind of independent growth I was hoping to see, Naruto. Genuinely. Most shinobi struggle considerably more with unsupervised practice of a new, dangerous skill, the temptation to push too far, too fast, without a mentor there to catch mistakes, trips up far more experienced students than you. Guess I finally figured out how to actually be patient, Naruto said, a lopsided grin spreading across his face. Only took me, 12 years? Better late than never, Kakashi said dryly, though the warmth in his tone undercut any real edge to the comment. This changes things a little, actually. If you're demonstrating this level of independent discipline, I think we can start introducing slightly more structured technique work, rather than just foundational control exercises. Still careful. Still gradual. But genuine progress towards something more concrete. Naruto's eyes lit up at that. Like an actual jutsu? A real one, not just holding a flame steady? Perhaps, Kakashi said, with the careful, measured caution of a teacher unwilling to promise more than he could reasonably deliver. We'll see how the next several sessions progress. But yes, I think it's time to start building towards something more substantial. The Chunin exams are coming up in a matter of weeks, after all, and while I have no intention of pushing you toward using this ability in that setting prematurely, it wouldn't hurt to have genuine options available, should circumstances demand them. The mention of the Chunin exams settled a fresh, familiar knot of anticipation in Naruto's stomach, equal parts excitement at the prospect of proving himself against a wider field of competition, and lingering unease about exactly how much longer this particular secret could realistically stay contained once he was thrown into direct, high-stakes competition against shinobi from every corner of the elemental nations. You think I'll need to use it? He asked. In the exams, I mean? I hope you won't need to, Kakashi said honestly. But I'd rather you have the option available and never need it, than need it and not have it ready. That's exactly why we keep training, carefully, deliberately, exactly the way you've already proven yourself capable of handling. The weeks that followed settled into a productive, if demanding, rhythm. Team 7's regular training resumed its usual pace, sparring drills, teamwork exercises, the steady accumulation of skill and coordination that came from working alongside the same teammates day after day. Sasuke's shoulder healed fully, his suspicion about Naruto's strange chakra during the bridge fight gradually settling into a quiet, watchful patience rather than active pursuit, though Naruto never quite managed to shake the feeling that his rival hadn't fully let the question go, merely tabled it for a more convenient moment. Alongside that regular training, Naruto's private sessions with Kakashi continued at their careful, structured pace, foundational control work gradually giving way to more concrete technique development, small, deliberate steps towards something that might, eventually, resemble a genuine, functional jutsu built from his rare dual nature. He grew stronger in that time, in ways that went beyond simple technique. The discipline required to manage a dangerous, unpredictable ability carefully, patiently, without the constant temptation to push past his current limits, began bleeding into other areas of his training as well. A new, unfamiliar patience in his approach to chakra control exercises generally, a sharper, more deliberate focus during sparring sessions that even Kakashi noted with quiet, genuine approval. It wasn't a transformation anyone beyond his small circle of secret keepers would have noticed dramatically. Naruto remained, in every outward respect, the same loud, stubborn, occasionally reckless genin the village had always known. But underneath that familiar exterior, something genuinely new was taking shape, built slowly and carefully over weeks of disciplined, private effort that nobody beyond Kakashi and, at a careful distance, the watchful, protective attention of the Hokage himself, fully understood. And as the date for the Chunin exams drew steadily closer, Naruto found himself facing that milestone with a confidence that felt different, somehow, from his usual brash, performative bravado, quieter, steadier, rooted in the genuine, hard-won knowledge that he was carrying something real inside him now, something earned through patient effort rather than simple stubborn refusal to quit. He had no way of knowing, of course, exactly how soon that careful, hard-won discipline was about to be tested. Not in the safety of a private training ground, but in the middle of a forest crawling with dangerous rivals, foreign shinobi, and at least one figure whose reputation for cruelty and unpredictability would make Uzumaki look almost restrained by comparison. The Chunin exams were coming. And Naruto Uzumaki, whatever else he was walking into that arena carrying, was about to discover exactly how much harder it was to keep a secret buried when the whole world was suddenly watching.